Good afternoon. The Maryland Public Service Commission will come to order in Administrative Docket RM56. This is with respect to revisions to the Code of Maryland Regulations, Title 20, Subtitle 62, titled Community Solar Energy Generation Systems. So our rulemaking proceeding today, we have a proposal from staff of the commission. We also have proposals from other parties that are before us today. In our witness box, we have Commission Senior Advisor Amanda Best, who will be called upon to help facilitate the conversation. What we're going to do today in order to make the best use of our time and to make rulings is we'll allow staff to begin with a presentation. Will that presentation be on the screens? It may be. Checking now. And I'll allow each of the parties 1 minute to provide an opening statement by which they could use that 1 minute however they'd like. I know we have a number of at least 8 or 9 parties here. Maryland Energy Administration, I believe, is not present today. No, that's okay. So we'll go, why don't we do introductions and appearances, beginning with our staff counsel, and then we'll follow up with 1 minute statements.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, Annette Garofalo and Philip Vanderhayden on behalf of Commission staff.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and fellow Commissioners. Jacob Auslater on behalf of the Office of People's Counsel.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, Harry Warren here today on behalf of CCSA and Summit Ridge Energy.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Matthew Seeger is appearing on PEPCO and Delmarva. I'll primarily be speaking for the Exelon Utilities, but also appearing with me is Mr. Dan Herson from BGE.
Thank you. Ms. Miller.
Thank you. Susan Miller, Clean Energy Attorney with Earth Justice. I'm appearing on behalf of the low and moderate income advocates, which include Chesapeake Positions for Social Responsibility, Climate Access Fund, Coalition for Community Solar Access, Forefront Power, Brownsville Institute for Energy and Environmental Research, Montgomery County Green Bank, Neighborhood Sun, NextCamp, and Solstice.
That's a long list, Ms. Miller.
Hopefully you won't make me say it again.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. Todd Chasen and David Bugelmans on behalf of CCSA.
Thank you.
Hello, Commissioners. My name is John Forgash. I'm here on behalf of Soul Harvest Energy.
Any other appearances at this point? Obviously, the state legislature earlier this year with Senate Bill number 520 put into law some changes that will require this rulemaking today. There are other proposals to expand this rulemaking and use it as an opportunity to make additional changes to our, I'll use the acronym CSEG regulations. And those arguments and requests for clarification will be entertained. Before we begin with staff's presentation, which is now on the screens, I'll allow any of the parties to make a 1 minute opening statement. We could go in the same order that we just went, or if you don't wish to make a statement, you don't need to. So we'll skip staff if that's okay. Mr. Auslander.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Office of People's Counsel agrees with the proposed revisions as submitted by staff, and we would recommend that the Commission adopt them without any changes. As we pointed out in our comments, we believe that the proposed changes are consistent with the revisions to the community solar statute that the legislature made this past legislative session. We also believe that some of the issues raised by some of the other parties regarding LMI verification are important issues, but as OPC understands it, the Commission has set aside a separate process for dealing with that issue, and we plan to submit comments on January 6th as directed by the Commission.
That is an important point, Mr. Auslander, because I know that some of the comments focused on LMI eligibility, and yes, we will be handling those in early January, so they are not germane to today's proceeding. Mr. Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. CCSA, in its comments that it filed before the Commission in this docket, and many of the comments of other members of CCSA and supporting organizations, you'll see that in terms of the staff proposals, there are some elements that the industry agrees with, and some which it would like to see some revisions from staff's proposal. In addition, you'll see there are a set of approximately 8 other recommendations that are made to facilitate the program based on what's been learned over the past 2 to 3 years of beginning this program that we think will lead to more efficient administration, more clarity for all participants in the market. And so we thank you that you're going to entertain those suggestions as well.
Thank you, Mr. Warren. You will have an opportunity as we go through staff's presentation, hear their defense of their proposal, to make any argument in favor of your proposal.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could I also indicate that on some of these issues, I may ask that you allow other parties from the CCSA group to come forward to the podium and address specific issues that they are prepared to address.
That will be just fine. Mr. Seegers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The Exelon Utilities submitted written comments in which we commented on various portions of staff's proposed revisions. As indicated in our written comments, we're not seeking any changes to what staff has proposed, but we're merely seeking clarification on how some of the proposed regulations are to be interpreted. And we're seeking to highlight these issues now so that the Exelon Utilities later on down the road are not put in the position of having to make a unilateral decision on how the regulations are to be interpreted. How the regulations are to be interpreted should be discussed and determined first in the working group and then ultimately by this commission. So we are here to answer any questions, and as you indicated, Mr. Chairman, we will submit any comments we have as we go through staff's presentation.
Thank you. I am aware that Exelon made a number of requests for clarification. It is somewhat times awkward on the bench with 5 of us asking recommendations of. We will do our best to provide that clarification. I will rely on Senior Advisor Amanda Best also to assist me in coming up with some of these determinations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Herson, you're covered.
Nothing additional to add. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My organization filed the comments that addressed the low-income verification. We did that out of an abundance of caution, just so that the commission was aware that the position of staff was not a 100% consensus issue, and we were concerned that you might take steps that would inadvertently prevent at least a consideration of our concerns. So we're perfectly fine with waiting to January to discuss them with that caveat. My organization also has concerns about the capacity increases by staff, where we don't believe it meets the statutory requirement, and we're concerned about the 5% LMI added to the open.
Okay, so you have some issues that are germane to today's proceedings, and
Yes, sir.
when we are on that topic, please approach the podium and you'll be recognized.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other opening statements? Okay, well, I will turn it over to our staff team, Mr. Vanderheyden or Ms. Garofalo.
Thank you, Your Honor. This afternoon, staff is proposing revisions to COMAR 2062, principally based on the requirements of SB 520, which was enacted into law after the most recent legislative session. Additional changes may be appropriate in the future, but staff is not proposing anything beyond what was submitted on November 25th, 2019 for consideration at today's rulemaking. Specifically, staff has proposed language designed to increase the length of the community solar program from 3 to 7 years, to increase allowed capacity of the community solar program each of the additional years. Staff also proposes to increase LMI capacity, and finally, based on experience, staff proposes to increase the time frame for applicable deadlines before a waiver is required. As a note, on page 1 of the proposed regulations, staff proposed a change of the word conducts to conduct. We'd like to delete this proposed change. It was right the first time, and I guess it was enacted in a frenzy of grammatical imprecision. Mr. Vanderheyden will walk us through the details of staff's proposed changes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. I'm Phil Vanderheyden with the Commission staff. I function as the working group leader for the net metering working group, which was designated to address development of the community solar program and the regulations. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the working group's activities over the summer and some of the kind of the purpose of the regulations before we go into a page-by-page review of each of the changes we're making to the regulations. So the SB 520 HB 683 went into effect June 1 of 2019, So the working group, I'm sorry, the working group began having teleconferences over the summer, beginning in July. We've met approximately 6 times, or precisely 6 times. We have about 2-hour conference calls where the parties have the opportunity to raise issues and discuss items relative to not only this particular issue, but some of the other items that are in front of the commission or will be in front of the commission regarding the net metering program. But for the most part, our activities have engaged the community solar program and its changes. There are a few consensus items in the regulations in front of you. I will go over just briefly the non-consensus items before we dive in. I think the largest issue is the scale of the program. There was direction in the new legislation to expand the program, so we've developed a schedule for that expansion, and there are disagreements about how large that should be. I'll cover that when we get to those pages. Staff has, on top of the changes to comply with the program specifically, there are some suggestions we're making about changing the program that we believe are relatively minor, but will identify and repair some problems we've been having with the program going forward without making major changes. One of the kind of major non-consensus items is exactly that, as to how far we should go with this rulemaking. I think that's where you'll hear from some of the other parties. The consensus items are, there is an operational deadline extension. You're familiar with the waivers that you've seen for these projects. They've come in front of you. We're effectively doubling those deadlines, giving from 12 to 24 and 18 to 36 months respectively for the types of deadlines. And we'll get into that. I believe that's a consensus. Extending the pilot program from 7 years to 3 is also a consensus, but it's required by the legislation. And there is also the removal of the 350 subscriber per project limit that no one's disagreeing with, because it is also part of the legislation. All right, so and I've already covered this a little bit. I will be brief on this slide. The compliance items for SB 520 are removing the limit on subscribers, extending the program, and increasing capacity. As a summary, the additional items that staff is recommending to improve the program in the near term is attempting to make a change to increase the LMI participation, and a desire to also reflect that there haven't been a lot of small projects, meaning, and we're defining that here for less than 50 kilowatts, so something that may fit on a number of rooftops, perhaps in a townhouse environment, or just smaller projects. So we're carving out an additional amount of, a very small amount of space for that. And as I mentioned before, doubling the amount of time that projects have to become operational. And then we also have a few housekeeping and typographical corrections that aren't directly related to any policy changes. The table down at the bottom of slide 3 here, this is copied from our net metering report the Commission released in September 2019. So this data is as of June of 2019, and this shows you the amount of capacity that has been offered by each of the 4 participating utilities, the amount that has been accepted, both by utility and the total, and then the 9.6 megawatts shows you that at the time the number of projects megawatts that were operating. So I'll just briefly go over the legislative changes so we have in our presentation some of the language. The first change removes the limit on the number of subscribers, so it simply is adding that there is no limit, and so that we'll need to remove the regulation that imposes one. The second change is essentially extending the program so that it won't end before 2024, so December 31, 2024, and you'll see changes that also reflect that new ending date. And then the change that I think introduced the most non-consensus issue is this language here, which states that the annual capacity for each program category, each of which shall increase throughout the duration. So the Commission sets the scale of the pilot program, the number of projects. This is providing some additional direction from the legislature that the amount of capacity is going to increase throughout the duration of the pilot program. So the interpretation of that will get into the development of the regulations. All right, this one's easy. We're withdrawing this. This was as was mentioned by Ms. Garofalo. This was a change we initially thought was a grammatical correction we need to make, so we are essentially withdrawing this item. As we go through the slides, as we walk through the changes, I have the chapter information up at the top. There'll be a box that's attempting to kind of describe the need or the reason for the change very generally. And then we will bracket out things we're removing, and we will highlight the text that is changing, and we're showing any new changes in italics.
Thank you. And after you do that, Mr. Vander Hayden, that will be the opportunity for any party to express any concerns or counter proposals.
Thank you. All right, so moving on. This is the language. We're simply going to address the length. Previously it stated 3 years. Now it will state 7. And then there is a specific end date we are adding that it says will not end prior to December 31st, 2024, which is what the legislation directs. I think we originally had filed 24 in there, so that entire subsection B or section B there is being added in, as you can see, in italics. And then we are simply relettering the following. So I believe this is more or less a consensus item. All right, the second, here in Chapter 2, this is where the statewide capacity limit is addressed. So this slide and the next couple behind it are, I think, where we're going to have to spend some time talking about the increase in the capacity. Right now, the capacity is designated as 1.5% of the 2015 Maryland peak demand. And the Commission, when developing the regs and the follow-on tariffs, identified that amount of, which I have a little bit further down in the presentation, that allows us to precisely calculate not only the total amount in the state program, but also the amounts that each utility will have. So we are effectively replacing 1.5 with 3.0 for the total statewide. There will be a corresponding change to that number of 1.5 to 3.0 in each of the utility specific numbers that happen a little further down. So I'll just go over the second thing we're changing on here. Both of these, I believe, are controversial to some of the other parties.
So, Mr. Vander Hayden, is this the time to ask why you picked 3%?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I think we were looking for a number that represented a significant increase. So doubling the program size is significant in our view. There is not an analytical method that we use to develop this number. We took into account the current status of the net metering cap. The net metering cap is 1,500 megawatts. As of the 2019 net metering report, which I think I have the data a little bit further down, there is approximately 754, or about half of the capacity in that program has been used up. And there's a little arithmetic you have to do to figure out how much of the existing community solar is incorporated within that, and then how much will be used if the existing amount is taken up. You'll see a little bit further down in the presentation. If we were to increase the program by the 3%, would add effectively an additional 192 megawatts for about a total of 384 within the program. That for community solar, that would then be added to about 744 megawatts if we account for the fact that there are already 10 community solar megawatts counted within the net metering cap. So our concerns about expanding this program much beyond what we have suggested here gets at we would be possibly using up much of the remaining 1,500. There will be approximately 372 remaining if the Commission accepts 3%, and all of that capacity is used within the next 4 years. It's unknown as to how much capacity will be used by the standard net metering projects that arrive or that are built in Maryland in that time frame. But here we are in 2019, I think about 22 years into our program, and we're standing roughly at 754 megawatts. I think we are seeing perhaps a 100 megawatt increase over the last few years, but it's variable and depends on a number of other things that it's hard to predict. So
So your concern is that the community solar will take up too much of the total?
that is one concern. That is one concern. That might be the largest concern when I think of sort of balancing the two programs. The other is that we are often reminded that this is in fact a pilot program, and there were many folks I think who were objecting to the scale of the original program. So with respect for those positions and the way the commission originally resolved the issue of how big this program should be, we thought by expanding in about the same amount would also be an appropriate way of recognizing that there is clearly a desire to expand the program, and yet also there's a need to incorporate all the guidance we've received thus far. There's a couple more pages further down where I try to explain how much of the existing capacity has been used, and as a percentage of what we have remaining. But I think that is our primary concern. Obviously, there's the limit is imposed by the legislature at 1,500. This program is specifically incorporated within that limit. So if we were to expand this, perhaps using some other metrics, I think folks have suggested that, hey, there's a RPS standard that's expecting a lot more solar to be built. You should expand this piece of it. The community solar program with the eye towards having a significant piece of that new responsibility, but at the same time, until the net metering cap is changed, it's possible that unintentionally we would push out some of that capacity. That there is also a growing industry out there of folks who make these installations, and there's probably a number of folks that would wish to participate as rooftop solar as well. All right.
Right. So did you say you did consider the new RPS standard in setting in doubling basically the community solar? Because I mean, you look at what the legislature did, they've increased it 7 times. We now there's an expectation of 14.5% coming from solar energy. So I mean, do you believe that this recommendation to just double is consistent with the direction of the legislature at this point?
It is not directly consistent with scaling this program with the same multiple that we see for the rest of the solar carve out, and that was suggested by a number of folks. I think if we actually attempted to scale that way, it would exceed the 1,500 megawatt cap. So we would really be prevented from following that particular approach without removing the 1,500 megawatt cap.
Well, right. I mean, there's an expectation in just the next few years we are going to exceed that cap, or at least reach that cap, and that'll be a decision for the legislature to make. But has the legislature, to your knowledge, stated specifically we should leave room in the 1,500 megawatt for particular technologies or for other solar projects? I mean, have they said specifically, oh no, we shouldn't give too much to community solar and not to other solar projects? Is there something that we should glean from a legislative action on that?
I do not know of any direction within the legislation that imposed the increase that gives direction relative to that. It appears to maintain the kind of the decision-making process with the commission to select the capacity for the community solar program.
Okay, so we're not guided otherwise, just that there's a cap that we're going to hit one way or another if we achieve our RPS goal. You're just suggesting that we leave room, or we should not use it with community solar for some reason.
I'm suggesting that it's beneficial to both programs to not have one impose a constraint that might affect the other at this point.
Okay.
Mr. Vanderheyden, now might be a good time for Mr. Warren to jump in, unless you had additional thoughts.
Yeah, there was another change on there, but it's a separate issue, so we can get back to that after we've talked about
So
the
Mr. Warren, you're advocating not doubling but tripling the amount.
Yes, as Commissioner, I think there are some other, if I could just ask Phil, there are some other changes. There's some further language where staff actually specifies the year-by-year increases that they're also specifying. So I'll ask people to address all of that, at this time.
I think we get to that in the next slide.
Okay.
Is that right?
Yeah. It's,
Year by year? Yeah.
Okay.
I can
Yeah.
pull
Well,
that
just
up.
be clear, then it's part of the same issue in terms of the scale up as well as the overall program cap.
Just to understand, I mean, if we leave this number in, then that kind of flows through your other numbers of concern, correct? So,
They all fit together, but
Right,
we
so
can certainly
what's-
call people at this time.
Okay.
This slide and the next. Right.
Right, there you go. That's the years 4 through 7 there. That's all kind of part of a package, the overall size and then the year-by-year increases. Right, so then as I mentioned, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to, I would ask you to invite up to the podiums some of the other CCSA members who were prepared to provide specific rationale around these
Okay.
around these subjects.
If you could please state your name and affiliation.
Sure. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. My name is Greg Werner. I'm a business development manager with Nexamp. We are a solar development company based in Massachusetts with significant operations in Maryland. And more importantly, we are a CCSA member. I will try to keep my comments to a few important items on the capacity expansion, but I think others will be chiming in as well. So I have three main points that I want to address about this very important capacity issue. The first is that the community solar program has been a success, and I'm proud to say that Nexamp has been a part of that success story. Starting with our first 2-megawatt solar project in Queen Anne's County, which started operation in June of this year. We have more projects that are about to start construction that are shovel-ready in the next few months, and then after that, the year after that, we have a robust pipeline of projects behind that. These are the signs of a successful pilot program whose purpose is to spur private investment into a new economic opportunity. By its nature, a pilot program is a stepping stone to a stable, long-term industry. It takes time to learn the nuances of a program. It takes time to hire out the right people. It takes time to build out a great team, and it takes time to build out the relationships with good contractors. But that's the point of a pilot program. To allow time for the gradual growth, to build a healthy, vibrant industry that can build great projects that deliver clean, affordable, and locally produced electricity to our customers. In fact, saving them money every month. Now, the staff's proposal, unfortunately, would essentially do just the opposite. By setting the same megawatt number in the 4-year expansion of the program as we had during the initial 3-year expansion, that would actually reduce the annual capacity that's added to the program year over year, slamming on the brakes at exactly the moment that developers like Nexamp have built up their expertise, built out their teams, and built out their contractor relationships. The result would not be just fewer projects, but more expensive projects. Without the critical mass to establish our own in-state industry and workforce, developers like Nexamp would be increasingly forced to rely on out-of-state contractors with less expertise and more money to build the same project. This is not just bad for developers, it's bad for consumers as well. Secondly, as Commissioner Richard actually pointed out earlier, I would like to point out that the legislature has not been silent since the creation of this community solar program, as you know. On the contrary, they've spoken quite loudly, this year passing a massive increase in the RPS. And I apologize for setting a bunch of numbers here, but the numbers really do matter. They're important. Specifically, the solar carve-out within the RPS increased from 2.5% by 2020, the end goal for it, to 14.5% by 2028, which is almost a 6-fold increase. Alternatively, let's look at a specific year, 2017. That was the first year of the community solar pilot program. In that year, the solar carve-out was 1.15% of Maryland's load. Compare that to the first year of the community solar extension program, which will be 2021. In that year, the carve-out will be 7.5% of Maryland's load. Again, a 6-fold increase. CCSA's proposal sets the capacity for the extension at merely twice the amount of the original program, roughly 384 megawatts, depending on how they get counted, and gradually increases that amount annually, year over year. This is a restrained and responsible goal. In short, CCSA proposal not only captures the legislative intent of the community solar pilot program, but it also understands and leverages the realities of how solar projects actually get built by allowing for a steady increase in growth as companies like Nexamp build out their teams and build better projects for Maryland consumers. And thirdly, I would just like to note regarding the concern that was raised earlier regarding the potential for this community solar program to essentially take up most or all of the remaining capacity under the net metering cap. We have been actually working hand in hand with MDVCIA, who's not here today, but they represent not just community solar developers like CCSA and our fellow members, but also utility scale developers and residential developers. Those are their bread and butter members. They have fully signed on to our proposal. And I'm not sure if that's been reflected in the record and in the filings that have been made so far, but we will definitely make sure that that is the case because that is, they have in fact fully signed on to our proposal. So the companies that are actually have an issue at stake with keeping capacity available for residential systems to get net metering capacity, they are fully signed on to CCSA's proposal because they understand the dynamics of how this is going to play out going forward. So, thank you very much.
Let me ask you a question before you leave, sir. Did your projects in Maryland encounter delays, the ones that are operational?
They did, in fact, yes.
And did you get waivers for those?
We did, yes. We
Yeah.
got a deposit. We got a 6-month extension through the deposit, and we got an additional 4 months, I believe. This was for Chester Woods Point Solar. That started operating in June. It's like a 4 or 5 month extension that we got from the commission.
Did you have any projects that did not receive waivers or extensions?
Frankly, we only had one project in that first year. We have 2 more projects at least coming this coming year. And at this point, we don't think that they will need extensions, but we're not done with the permitting process entirely. So, and there's also been delays of the program that have essentially added
Yeah.
time to the clock for us.
Do you think, is there any concern in the industry that an expanded first-year capacity may allow certain developers to gobble up that capacity and then use the next several years with delays and extensions to kind of sit on it?
No, I think I don't want to speak for all of our CCSA members, but all of us understand the realities of developing a project, and 1 year is just a very short amount of time to actually develop a project. So frankly, all of us want to have that extra year, so 2 years total, time to develop a project once it's submitted.
But I'm talking about the extra capacity that I think I hear you asking for, as opposed to staff's recommendation.
So I don't think we have it up on the screen, but CCSA's proposal would essentially gradually increase the annual capacity year over year during the 4-year extension. I may have the numbers wrong, but it's like 0.6%, 0.7, 0.8, 0.9, something to
But
that
you characterize staff's recommendation as slamming the brakes on.
Correct, because essentially we had an average of 0.5% capacity becoming available in the first 3 years, and now it's going to be an average of.
I'm just trying to probe, might there be another reason why we don't want too much capacity in the first year?
I think the argument that I would make for not having too much capacity in the first year and rather spreading it out and sort of gradually increasing it is that that lines up with how companies like us actually build out our teams. We're hiring people right now. We're building relationships with contractors, and it's we haven't reached our full potential yet. So let's gradually increase the capacity in each year of the extension. I'm not sure I entirely follow your question about the first year.
That's all right. Maybe I'll get to it later.
Okay.
Well, maybe.
Sorry. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If you could state and spell your name for the record.
Sure. My name is Salar Naini. That's SALAR NAINI.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. My name's Salar Naini, Vice President of Business Development with Turning Point Energy. We are a clean tech development company focused on utility scale and community solar applications. And specifically here in Maryland, we've been participating in the working group calls since early 2016, and we're very proud of all the strides the program has made to date. So really getting to the point of this particular issue here, really CCSA feels there are two aspects of this that really fall short of the legislative intent. So specifically, Mr. Chairman, I think you brought up on the previous slide and the idea of the 1.5% initial pilot program size for years 1 through 3, and the fact that this proposal only increases that by another 1.5%. Going a little bit against the legislative intent, in our view, to increase the capacity from previous levels. That's kind of one way of looking at it. I think the other way of looking at it is in this slide that you have before you, where you can see that you have years 1, 2 at 0.6, then you go down to 0.3, and then kind of with staff's proposal, you're building off that 0.3%. And so I think originally this program was, is my belief that the program was designed kind of front-loaded to spur development. And so, going simply off that third year, we just don't believe is adequate. And so I think what you'll see in the CCSA proposal is that on a year-to-year basis, it really kind of goes off of that year two number.
Right, it doubles from year 3 to year 4 from 0.3 to 0.6.
Correct. And more in line with years 1 and 2, I guess, is the point I'm trying to make there. I think second, the meaning, any pilot program and the intent of the legislation is to really give us an extended period of time to analyze the program and come up with a meaningful sample set in order to eventually, hopefully, expand the program into something more permanent. And so one of the unintended consequences that we believe and we provided comments on as it relates to this is if you look at, particularly with some of the categories in some of the utilities where you don't have as much of the state load, so specifically Delmarva and First Energy. For example, if you look at the LMI category in Delmarva for year 4, with staff's current proposal, that would be about a 1.1 megawatt total capacity available under that bucket. And so for a program where a majority of the projects are 2 megawatts, we just believe that having kind of a more modest increase to the program doesn't give you a meaningful apples-to-apples comparison for all projects, and to eventually decide whether or not it's something that the state decides to expand. So we believe that CCSA's proposal is more in line with that. So I'll pause there in case anybody has any questions on any of that. Okay, thank you for your time.
Thank you. We don't have MEA, the Energy Administration, the State Energy Administration, here today. Their comments advocated not setting goals for the years 4 through 7, if I understand that correctly. I'm a little perplexed as to why, but they're not here to explain themselves today. So we have two competing proposals before us. Mr. Vander Hayden, I know I switched gears before turning it over to Mr. Warren and his associates. Do you have anything to add on this topic?
Your Honor, I think folks have been very helpful in describing their needs, for getting the program running and making sure that the developers they can see a path where they can make continuous investments over time. We'll help to develop the industry, and I agree with that. There's probably something else the Commission might want to take into account is these are being proposed in many cases as larger 1 megawatt and up, possibly 2 megawatt projects. There probably are some concerns about slowing the rollout of those because many of the local governments and quite possibly the folks who would live in some of the areas where these systems would be installed may also need time to react to the programs that, or to these installations. There have been, to my knowledge, a number of delays that we have dealt with in waivers that had to do with kind of the zoning process. And just anecdotally, I know that there are objections from some of the folks who live in some rural areas of the state regarding, that those tend to be the areas where land is cheap enough to purchase. So it is certainly our responsibility to kind of foster the development of the industry, but I think it's also important for the commission to think about how, in addition to some of the rooftop programs might be impacted, but there's also some impacts to society from the areas where these projects are constructed. So that's another reason to not so much try to slow things down, but make sure that everyone has an opportunity to react.
Thank you. Do commissioners have additional questions on this topic before we make a ruling?
But isn't the place for them to react at the zoning level and not at the commission level, because that's, the local, the siting is done locally, in the county or municipality and so on. Isn't that where that where people who have concerns or people who are in favor of it isn't that where they participate and not necessarily here?
Yes, that's exactly what I mean, Your Honor. Certainly, there are folks who, may encounter this for the first time when they see a zoning notice go up, near to their home or, across the street from their business or something. They may not know. They may have to learn what's happening, what their concerns are. Possibly the folks within each of the counties that are affected here need to understand what's coming towards them. Do they need to prepare themselves with their own regulations, that sort of thing. So I think we've had a couple of years now, and I think you're seeing the part of the reason why we only have some very small percent, 10 megawatts out of perhaps 154 megawatts of offered capacity operating at the moment is because there have been slowdowns at that level, and maybe that is also been beneficial to those folks so that they have a fair opportunity to evaluate whether or not they, how they want to react in the zoning. So it's the commission controls the level of projects that can come into the system. And I think the utility folks seem to be able to manage the interconnection process at the scale that we've been dealing with so far. I believe this proposal would not affect them in terms of being able to handle interconnections, because it is on par with what we've dealt with. But for folks who are dealing with their local zoning process, this is, I think, something where the commission can control the flow. They're kind of like where the commission's in control of the faucet, how fast these projects can come out, and it gives the local jurisdictions more time to deal with them, and it may slow down the rate so that folks who want to identify what's good for their community have the opportunity to also become aware of and learn what they need to do in response to some of these things.
Well, again, to me, I think that by adding the time on the other parts of the regulations, we're acknowledging that there are questions related to siting, so I'm not sure whether the staff proposal provides any additional opportunity for people to be involved, or for a county to put in regulations or processes. I think they're already aware that these things are coming, and so I'm, that to me is that doesn't necessarily help me pick a number. Let me just put it to you that way. But from CCSA's point, is there any basis in your numbers, 6, 7, 8, 9? Is that just because it's sequential? What's we have some understanding, and Mr. Vanderheyden says he picked a number, because he's concerned about preserving room under the cap, which is a legislative cap, and so you'd have to go change things at the legislature. So why is CCSA thinking that these are the right numbers?
Well, let me give a response, and then again, there may be some other members of the organization that have some color on this as well. So I think original reading of the legislation was, well, the language in the legislation is that the capacity in every category is supposed to grow every year. That was what was asked for in the legislation. And I think as was pointed out earlier, you know, the average capacity on an annual basis under the current program was about 0.5% a year of the Maryland 2015 peak. So we had now again, as was mentioned, we kind of front-end loaded that to get the program going, but the average for those first 3 years was 0.5 for each year. So I think one initial number was you look at that and you say, okay, going from a 0.5, 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, 0.9, this was bringing additional capacity across all categories for the program each year of the pilot program. Now, staff is also arguing that they've accomplished the same thing by using 0.3 as their base and adding 0.25% of increase, you know, each year, which across the entire program adds about 3 megawatts of total capacity for the whole program each year as the definition of growth. So I think that it was, so at one level it seemed consistent with the legislative intent to ramp that up. And then there was some debate within the CCSA community about exactly how big did the program need to be. There were some people who thought it should be much larger. Sort of to Commissioner Richards' comment, you know, the RPS standard was increased, you know, several fold, you know. But I think they kind of came back and they said this looked like a compromise that sort of seemed to give additional growth to bring new people into the market, wasn't so big that it was causing some of the problems about, you know, overrunning the capacity and in the net metering cap that was discussed. It seemed like a meaningful growth, you know, for 4 years to be bigger than the initial 3 years by some meaningful margin, but not too big as to clearly invite some of the other concerns, you know, that were raised. But I don't know, there may be others who would like to provide you some color on that, or not.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Mr. Vanderheyden, as the work group leader, I'm curious regarding a point that the chairman made earlier regarding MEA's absence here today, and their suggestion that we not select different ranges for the next couple of years. They participated in the work group meetings.
Yes, Your Honor.
I'm not asking you to make their arguments for them, but could you give us just a high-level summary, if you will, of what their rationale was during the meetings as you were monitoring and managing them?
Yes, Commissioner. My understanding is that the concerns they had about expanding the program were not that they didn't want to increase the size, but they thought that given the kind of some of the delays we're experiencing, we haven't come close to using the full capacity of the entire program. It's only certain categories. My understanding is that they thought that it might be premature to begin expanding the program before using up the existing capacity in the program. I think that's as simple as I can get it, but I'm sure there's some nuances that I'm not picking up on.
No, that's fair enough. You know, it's their position, so they should, if it needs to be made, it's not for you to make it. But I was just curious about that. I'm wondering if is there any benefit to leaving the commission with more flexibility for some of the latter years of the program, in light of the fact that we have potential changes to our RPS policy. Now I know we have law now that is the law of today, and it's the law we're responding to. But if we pick goals through a COMAR process now that are in COMAR and are there, and the policies are changing at some point, assuming that they do, are we sending a signal to the industry that we now have to come back and do it all over again, or is the industry now? I mean, what's your thinking if 6 months from now we're looking at a different RPS policy than we have now, and the industry started responding to the regulation we just adopted, and now we're at a position where we have to look at it again?
Your Honor, I think that the benefit of stating specific increases by year is the certainty it provides for developers, allows them to begin to plan their schedule over the next few years. You lose the flexibility that you would have if, for example, these regulations allowed the commission to annually set the amount. You'd have much flexibility. Possibly that's something you could set by tariff, for each utility, or, at an administrative hearing, or perhaps we could have a rulemaking on that specific item each year to evaluate it. Those are certainly all possibilities. I would imagine that that creates some level of uncertainty for the developers. The other item that is not, that would play into this, that is not in front of you at the moment, is within the utilities tariffs, we will probably need to create language that will address how the utilities will accept projects going forward. The default has been first come, first served. We have used a kind of opening day kind of approach where we staggered the opening day 1 week apart for each of the 4 utilities, and they open the email address, and the emails come in, and in the order in which they come in, they're allowed to apply for interconnection, and then the order in which the interconnection, they're essentially released from interconnection in the order they were arrived at I think at least no less than a 24-hour period apart, which then allows the suppliers to apply for program capacity. So that has been what we have used for years 2 and 3, and for the first year, it has not yet been established that we will do so for years 4, 5, and 6. The Commission's order in 2017 that kind of got us all set up said you can use one process for year 1, an initial opening day, but we don't want all it to be, to be granted in that first year, because in years 2 and 3 there may be other participants who would not have the opportunity. So the Commission said we will have a second time frame for, and this is due to suggestions from a working group, and then years 2 and 3 will essentially use the same waiting list. So it will apply for capacity in years 2 and 3 one time. In that order, the order in which the application is won into the interconnection queue is how the megawatt hours will be apportioned for years 2 and 3. We will still need to do that for year 4. So the working group will have to go back and get a proposal for doing that to change these tariffs as well. That won't be something we have to do in the regulation. So that will affect some level of flexibility. So we have not, I think, attempted to integrate those two policies such that we could leave it flexible here and then control it either through tariffs. I think there was a desire from the Commission at the beginning of the program to not make frequent changes to these regulations. So that's, in order to gain the flexibility by changing the regulations, we would need to have, folks would have to understand there would be frequent changes. And that has been avoided because of the complexity of doing that and the need to provide certainty. But if that's something that the Commission is concerned about, we certainly, as a working group, could probably be directed to develop a way to leave it uncertain in the regs and then use tariffs to develop it. But that has not been something we have worked towards. It has been following the existing approach of setting the capacity by year in the regs.
Commissioner Linton, if I could add a thought on that. I think that CCSA would agree with the earlier part of Mr. Vanderheyden's thoughts there, that it is beneficial for the industry to see the scale, in this kind of pilot program with limits, to see the size of the program out into the future. As we know, the development timelines are long, so people who are starting development today know that they're building projects to be accepted into a program 2 or maybe 3 years down the road. So I think seeing that, as opposed to seeing an uncertain amount of capacity, that could come forward at, in some future regulation, is less optimal from the industry standpoint. So I think that seeing that runway is very helpful. That said, I would imagine that in the hypothetical that I think you were pointing out, if there were legislation in Annapolis that changed the character of RPS goals or things that had to be responded to, I do think the industry sort of understands that, there's a legislative dimension that could cause changes in the future, just as the extension of this pilot program, was introduced instead of us talking about the permanent program, rules today.
Thank you.
If
Mr.
he could briefly be heard in response to your question, Commissioner Linton, I think it's important to keep in mind that what we're talking about here with the community solar pilot program is which types of facilities are going to be afforded net metering treatment. So it's not actually directly connected to the solar RPS goals. I know it's not completely separate either, but I think we're really sort of to the extent that the conversation is focusing on the RPS standard rather than what the actual statute says, I think we might be going down the wrong path. The point of the pilot is to answer certain questions, and with the idea that when we deploy a wide program that might have really large caps or maybe no caps at all, certain lessons learned will help guide that program and achieve certain goals. One of which is the participation by LMI customers. If you look at the, and I understand that we're still in the early stages, even though this program started back in 2015, what we tend to see is that the open category gets filled up. So from where OPC is sitting, we've already can answer certain questions about how an open category would work. But I think there's a lot to be learned about how LMI could be, fostered. And to the extent that these capacity limits are tied to that statutory goal, if you want to retain flexibility, it should be in light of that. So to the extent that these, initial program capacity years were front-loaded, the reason for that was we wanted to accomplish a couple things. One, the capacity each year was going to roll over. The unused capacity was going to roll over each year. So we wanted to front-load it so that developers would come in and propose projects. We wanted to also keep in mind that there might be some delays, as that turned out to be the case, and that by the end of that third year, we would have enough different types of projects in order to perform that evaluation study that the legislation calls for. The other thing that it would do is, as the open category got consumed, more developers that had gained expertise in how to deploy an open category project would start to think, well, how can we economically do one of these projects for the LMI category, which is not 100% LMI. It only, under this, regulations, it only has to be 30% LMI. So I think with that in mind, the idea of bringing the program up near the total net metering cap is going to deprive the Commission of the flexibility that they would enjoy under staff's proposal.
Mr. Vanderheyden, let me ask you a question. Your numbers, if we adopted your annual cap numbers, would leave about 370 megawatts in the 1,500 megawatt cap left if all that annual cap was used and realized, right?
Yes, Your Honor.
If you took CCSA's numbers of 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, and 0.9, and all that annual cap was used, what would that take the total, where would that put us relative to the 1,500 megawatt net metering?
I think because they're, I believe, proposing 4.5 instead of 3, would add another 1.5%. So that's about 192 megawatts. So we would lose, about half, a little bit more than half of the remaining 372. So you subtract 370, or 200, so I guess you'd have, roughly 170 or so that would be left over.
Maybe 180.
180, yeah.
Something like that. Okay. All right. I'm not as certain as I hear people say, the legislature will simply just up the cap. I'm not so certain. There's a lot of reasons that cap exists. I was there when it was said. So don't get in your mind that that's a slam dunk. It's anything but. So I just would caution people about taking away the flexibility in these programs.
From the utility side, Mr. Vanderheyden seemed to imply that there might be an issue if the Commission did adopt the CCSA numbers. Is there any sort of concern from the utility side in terms of processing more projects?
I don't believe so, Your Honor. It's just the main question is, as we've been discussing, if you adopt CCSA's numbers, they will take us almost right up to the 1,500 megawatt cap. So, really, that's the main question here. But we don't have any
administrative issues that at least the Exelon companies foresee.
No, Your Honor. We don't have any administrative concerns.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll add, I don't believe we have any objection to Mr. Vanderheyden's numbers, and maybe it could be a little bit more, maybe it could be a little bit less. We can handle that, but we do share Commissioner O'Donnell's observations that if you do raise this number too much and the net metering capacity is eaten up, through the community solar projects, you might see an effort to get that expanded. And as he rightfully pointed out, that's not a guarantee in Annapolis. And I will also add that the utilities, frankly, if that was proposed, we may have some issues with that, because we do have some concerns with the way the existing net metering construct is set up in terms of compensation, because it can, in some instances, act as a situation where low and middle income folks are subsidizing those that are using net metering. So we're not there yet, but I think it is a cautionary tale. So Mr. Vanderheyden's trying to strike the appropriate balance. I think that's appropriate approach.
Any additional questions?
Well, just on that, I think I just heard Mr. Warren, you say that the solar industry as a whole is not concerned about this 1,500 megawatt issue. Is that correct? So it won't be that the community solar side is cannibalizing the rest of the industry. Did I hear you correctly just now?
That is correct. I think one of the other commenters that came up to the podium mentioned that as well. This is an issue that was brought before MDVC and discussed about the confluence of the various pieces here. And no, as a matter of fact, they said that they're not concerned about that. They're comfortable with this, sort of allowing the rooftop market to take as much as that capacity as it does, allowing the community solar opportunity to take as much capacity as community solar programs want to enjoy. I certainly hear Commissioner O'Donnell. We don't know what lies on the other side of that boundary, but as we go there, allowing both of those to grow, and putting the commission in a position of saying, well, we'll sort of ration the size of different sorts of programs, small versus large. I think they're whether it's rooftop or community solar or whatever, they're happy. They appear happy to allow any parts of the industry to compete for whatever that capacity is, going forward, and then.
That's not the only protection that 1,500 megawatt cap is there to protect against. There are a lot of other reasons, not just the difference between the bigger development and the rooftop. There are other, like the economies of the utilities, like the ability of the distribution system to accept and have. There's a lot of other reasons besides rooftop and larger scale developers that 1,500 megawatt cap exists to protect against. Not just the difference between the industry sectors.
And my next question would be, this is a topic that's going on around the nation, the whole NEMS 2.0, and really what happens, and other states are already ahead of us as far as to where they go. Many are just increasing their cap, and others are going on grid modernization so that they can support the types of renewables that states are demanding. So, I mean, I don't know if this is necessarily a discussion we have to have for today, but I was going to ask, Ms. Best or Phil, I mean, don't we already expect within about 2 years or so that we are going to hit the 1,500 megawatt cap just with normal growth in the industry? I mean, this is something that's coming anyway, and I think it's expected by the legislature. They would not have, enhanced the RPS to the point where we're going to need 5,000 megawatts of solar by 2030 to achieve this goal. So in the next few years, we're going to have to face this anyway. Is that correct?
I mean, my opinion is, that I think people in the industry are expecting that, as you point out, that is an issue that is going to have to be addressed. Certainly, if the state, wants to march on to meet its 14.5%, sort of interim, standard in the current RPS, that is going to have to be addressed in one way or the other. And as you suggest, there might be different paths forward. I think, again, I think the thought is that as far as what projects garner some of that cap in this interim period, whether it's 5 kilowatt projects or 1,000 kilowatt community solar projects, I think the industry seems to be comfortable with letting that be shared based on the success of people, within that category. And then, as you point out, what happens beyond that? Well, that's a question for the legislature, to figure out how to go forward when that.
But we really shouldn't be putting the brakes on either side of the industry at this point if we're going to meet these goals.
Yeah, certainly the industry is not concerned with putting the brakes on one side of the industry in order to make room for the other.
Your Honor, we added 84 megawatts this year, and 94 megawatts in 2018. So we've been running close to 100 megawatts a year. I think the previous year, I don't have that in the 2019 report. So it goes up and down. I think the tax credit ends this year. We may see kind of a push that's happening now for folks to capture that. Well, it doesn't end. It goes from 30 to 26. So we, at 754 megawatts, assuming the 100 or so megawatts that have been applied for in our existing net metering or community solar program are added to that, we're at 854. We will probably add another 100. So next, another 100 simply based on residential and rooftop solar coming in, aggregate net metering coming in. So next, I guess June of 2020, we may be looking at adding, we may be up to, close to 1,000 at that point. Maybe I expect a little bit less than 1,000, but it's hard to predict. Assuming we continue at that run rate of 80, 90, 100 megawatts per year with the rooftop, and then we know we have unbuilt 100 or so megawatts, I believe, of community solar that's not yet operating.
Okay.
Hopefully, we'll see most of that get in by next year. I'm not sure.
Yeah, we have to watch it because with SREC prices going up to meet the new demand because of the RPS, I mean, a lot of more development may be coming our way, which will use up some of this
Indeed.
1,500 megawatts.
So you may be right in saying that 2 or 3 years from now we will be looking at, are we going to hit the cap, and then the commission will have to be aware of that and then decide how to direct the utilities to close their programs or make changes to their programs to account for it.
Wouldn't you think the legislature would step in first? I mean, would they leave a mandate out here to hold solar and not
if the legislature
do the incentives?
Change the cap, then the commission wouldn't have to worry about hitting it. But I think the way our net metering tariffs run and the regulations, the commission will close applications or direct certain utilities once they hit their piece of the cap.
What's the trend for utility scale solar being added 2018, 2019? What are those numbers?
I don't have that information in what we tabulate for net metering, but we can find that for you.
Just keep in mind that RPS will be composed of that as well, which is a big piece too.
Any additional questions? We will now vote on this item with respect to the years 4 through 7. It's my position, well, it's fact that this state has very aggressive renewable energy goals. I think the success of the community solar program has yet to be seen. It's started a couple years ago in 2015, and the roll-up has been relatively slow. I hopefully we'll have a successful path in the years ahead. That being said, as long as the CSEG program operates under the 1,500 megawatt cap, and there's no guarantee that the state legislature will increase that cap anytime soon, I am concerned, and I share the concerns of the utilities and the 3 state agencies, staff, MEA, and OPC, that this potentially, going along with the CCSA program, would deprive other uses of this program. So for that reason, I support the staff's proposal. Commissioner Richard.
I do not support the staff proposal. I would support CCSA's numbers.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I'm supportive of the staff's proposal at this time. I think we can have time to adjust later, but for now, I think we ought to be very careful that we understand and not make assumptions. I think there's a good reason in the industry to want to have higher numbers right out of the gate, but I think a dose of caution here is appropriate, and we're still increasing what even CCSA termed as a successful pilot.
Commissioner Linton. Commissioner Linton.
I'm sorry. Thank you. I thought Commissioner Herman said something. I would support CCA's number. I actually would, if I had my own druthers, I probably would remove sections F and G, only to give us more flexibility on the back end of the pilot program. But that is not a proposal I would make at this time. I would just support the numbers that were offered by CCA.
Thank you. Commissioner Herman.
I'll note that I'm sitting at this end, and and, you know, the last always to be called on, but there's some power in being the last one to be called on here, so,
Yes, there
I'll
is.
just note that. You know, I have concerns with both proposals. I think staff, I have some concerns that staffs might be a little low with respect to the legislative intent, and I think CCSA's is a little too high because of the cap and my concern for the cap. So I'm going to propose that we potentially do a little bit of, these numbers do not appear to have a lot of, you know, it's not that anybody's picked 3.5 because, you know, these numbers because of one reason or another reason, hence my questioning about why the number. So I'm wondering how my fellow commissioners would feel about increasing, say, to 3.5, 4, 4.5, 5, or something a little bit more, but not enough to jeopardize the cap. And I don't know exactly where that would fall, and you know, because I don't have those numbers in front of me, but my concern is that the legislative intent is they get more, and we're only so fractionally more that it gives me a little bit of concern with legislative intent. And so that's where, you know, I'm coming out somewhere in the, you know, the Goldilocks position, you know, something that's a little more right, but not as high as CCSA because of the cap, and I do share those concerns with the cap. So I'll throw that out there and see where my fellow commissioners fall on that, or if we want to continue on and have somebody from staff prepare what, you know, would be the impact of such a change.
3.5, 4, 4.5, 5. Obviously, we have a remainder with staff's proposal as 370. I can't do the numbers. Could be something less than CCSA's, but more than staff's. Do my fellow commissioners have thoughts, or do the parties have thoughts? Commissioner Herman puts us in an interesting position, but she does have the deciding vote here.
I say, of course, I would go higher. So, I mean, I wish the industry had come in a little higher. Maybe that would have been a stronger negotiating point for you. Anyway.
Oh, I'm going to get in trouble for that. Thanks.
I would just say this, that the rationale that Commissioner Herman offers for her proposed numbers of 3.5, 4, 4.5, 5 is no less than what I've heard in terms of a rationale for the other numbers.
Well, and that's my point. That's my point.
It's not as far out there as one may think, because the other numbers didn't have a whole lot of. They had some rationale. Don't get me wrong. There was some rationale there, but in terms of what makes sense and what's right relative to each other, those numbers are just as good as any other numbers, I think.
I would tend to agree with you, Commissioner O'Donnell. I would ask the parties if they have any input or not on Commissioner Herman's proposal.
I just might offer one thought. I mean, I certainly respect Commissioner Herman's, you know, effort to sort of bring this to a good conclusion for everyone. Again, I think to her point of legislative intent, you know, I guess when we were preparing our thoughts, it seemed like the plain language of the law would have been that I would have expected, at least on an average annual basis, that years 4 through 7 would be bigger than years 1 through 3. They asked for the program to grow in every category. Now we're sort of captive to the fact that by front-end loading the first 3 years, as was pointed out, year 3 looks small, and so it forms this sort of small baseline. I think it would be a curious result, you know, if on an average annual basis the last 4 years didn't seem any bigger than the first 3 years. I mean, it is a 4-year extension to what was originally a 3-year program. So trying to do the mental math, I appreciate what Commissioner Herman is doing, and I think that, you know, that's probably better than the staff's proposal, you know, from the industry's standpoint. I would just ask, kind of to your same issue of legislative intent, if there's a way to sort of craft your compromise proposal that says the legislature would see that this was a program that was bigger than the first 3 years, you know, on some kind of a continuing basis. But that's just a thought. Again, I respect the fact that you're respecting that legislative intent and trying to help us come to a good outcome.
And you articulated that in your pleading.
Yeah, my concern is that Mr. Warren, you know, queuing off of the 6, then we end up pushing up against that cap. And I share my colleagues who have expressed concerns with running up against the cap. I share that. That's a significant concern. So, you know, what I'm trying to do is something that, because these numbers seem to be, you know, not, I don't know, seem to have, there's not, you know, mathematical necessarily basis other than the cap associated with the cap. So if we're using a number that's associated with the cap, maybe we could increase it a little, because I think legislative intent is a potential issue here, and that therefore do something different. And so that's hence the not trying to cause difficulty, but trying to reach an appropriate resolution on this matter.
And your proposal does provide a gradual increase, because in the 4th year it would be 25 basis points over staff, 5th year 50 basis points, 6th year 75 basis points, and the 7th year 100 basis points.
If you would just like the actual math on this, it would it would end up being a total increase of 1.7%, which would then take your total percentage of the 2015 peak to 3.2. So those are the maths on.
And where does that land me with the cap?
With the cap
1,500.
of the 1,500,
Yeah.
I'd need a little bit more time to run those numbers, but it would certainly be, you would have more space than you would still have more space.
Okay, thank you.
So with that, the previous slide would change from 3.0 to 3.2, not 4.5 that CCSA is advocating for. Are there any commissioners that oppose Commissioner Herman's proposal with respect to capacity limits?
I don't oppose, because it's at least larger than what the staff is proposing, but I agree that I don't think it meets the legislative intent. I mean, we're talking about a program that would be in the 2nd phase smaller than the 1st phase. I mean, that to me is a significant problem, but I guess we'll send this off to
I would disagree with,
and then we'll see if they agree, because I mean, it is true, we set basically on average a 0.5 on program of the first 3 years, but we wanted to be front loaded so that we would have enough data, because at the time we were really concerned about the report, and we thought if we did not get these projects up and running soon, at that time we didn't realize we were going to run into all the problems with the licensing, but you know, we need to get these up and running so we could have enough information to report. That did not bear out.
Well, okay.
So
we're
you know,
we're not debating any further.
It is important, because that's what the staff used. They used 0.3 the last year as our basis. You know, they could have at least used maybe year 2, and then we would have been, you know, at 0.6. But
And we were at 0.3 because it was front loaded.
Yeah, I mean,
As the commissioner,
I'm fine with the increase, but still don't think it meets the legislative intent.
Commissioner Richard, are you supporting the proposal?
I said yes, I am. I'm supporting Commissioner
It
Herman.
sounded like you were dissenting as well.
Well, no, I'm just saying I agree with the fact that it's deficient. But
Any other commissioners have statements?
I'm supportive of the issue, and I have to say this. I believe it meets the legislative intent. We front-loaded for a reason. We jump-started a pilot, and I think we're gradually, incrementally increasing the percents, the caps, and I think that meets the intent. So that's my opinion, and I'm sticking with it.
Thank you.
I'm fine with the proposal. I appreciate being the last on the vote. So it is a good place to be sometimes. I think the only thing I'll add, as I said it earlier, is that it's important to maintain some flexibility. This is a pilot program, and I'd note that at this point we would be drafting a report for the 3-year program that would help to inform some policy that the General Assembly and everyone else would be using to move forward with programs, and we're not at that point, and these issues are being discussed now. So you know, we've already got some lessons learned that we're trying to correct in this draft of our regulations. So I'm just trying to I'm hopeful that we'll maintain those lessons learned throughout the course of this. But I'm fine with the proposed revision.
That is a good note to end on. This is a pilot. It's a learning process. Hopefully we'll have good results at the conclusion. Mr. Vanderhayden, the next item.
Thank you, Your Honor. So to clarify, to make the numbers work out, we need to back up, and there was one item that we skipped over to get to this. So let me back us up here. So sorry, to slide 9. So where we have 3.0, where we were adding 1.5%, we are now adding 1.7. So that would make the 3.0 become a 3.2.
Correct.
Okay. So everywhere else, you're going to see that 3.0%, because it has the same thing for each utilities capacity. We will need to incorporate that 3.2% number. All right. So at the bottom of page 9, shown here, it's related but unrelated. There is a concern that staff had that the number of small projects within our program was very small, and by that I mean perhaps less than 5 or 10. I can think of 1 or 2 that exist in BG&E, and I possibly one in Potomac Edison. So we've carved out small as a category, but it's up at the 500 kilowatt level. I think there was a desire and an intent in the original legislation that small projects on rooftops, perhaps with 1 or more homeowners involved, we certainly have a category that is designated for that type of customer. So this is offered here for the consideration of the Commission. It is not a requirement of the SB 520, but the language at the bottom is all new in the highlighted section there in 02A1C. And this would, without an annual restriction, it would set aside 0.05% of the 2015 capacity for projects of 50 kilowatts or less. So 50 kilowatts was taken as a size that would incorporate something about 5 times the size of perhaps a 10 kilowatt residential installation, which might be what you would install if you were attempting to incorporate your entire annual use. The table I have on there is essentially the estimate of the number of megawatts that this would take up, and assuming a maximum 50 kilowatt size, the number of projects that would be eligible to be incorporated in the program. So this would essentially carve out a protected category without altering the category definitions that would allow a small group of perhaps neighbors to construct a community solar facility across the top of their homes, or perhaps on one neighbor's garage or barn or something of that nature, without them having to participate in the process by which we allocate capacity, which involves that initial opening day project. This is something that we would need to, with the Commission's direction, work out through the tariffs as to how each utility would specifically set their individual cap and the number of projects, that sort of thing. But this is simply suggested by the staff to address what we see as kind of a gap in the intent of the program to encourage smaller development. And it's not clear that that has been something that has been viable up to this point, possibly because of the competition for program capacity. So this is a very small amount of capacity, would roughly be about 6 megawatts out of the 300 and some total that you would now have in the program. The 0.05% set aside actually was an artifact of the way staff had set the 0.325, 0.5, 0.375. When you add those up, you come up to 3.95. So you had this extra left over, so staff proposed it as in order to round up the 3.0 amount from 1.5, there was this left over. Just perhaps to clarify, staff originally proposed to the working group that we simply divide 1.5 by 4. There was not, I think, an attempt to base our increase on the 0.3. That was just kind of an artifact of the arithmetic. So this is not required. It is suggested by staff as a means of opening an opportunity for some of these smaller systems to be incorporated without them having to compete directly with the large commercial projects that are going to use up most of the program.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Vanderheyden. Any comments or objections to that proposal? Commissioners have questions?
Mr. Chairman, I apologize. The Excellent Utilities don't oppose the staff's proposal, but as part of our comments, we sought clarification on how that is to be implemented, in the sense that is the 0.5%, is that going to become 100% available in year 4? And then if that 0.5%, if that's filled up by year 5, and then is it closed? Or is that to be spread out equally, or in any kind of installments, if you will, from years 4, 5, 6, and 7? I don't believe that we have a preference. We, once again, just want to get some clarification on how this is to be implemented.
Mr. Vanderheyden, do you have a...
Yes, Your Honor. I anticipate that we would use tariff language to specifically make that very clear as to how, and I believe we could impose limits on the annual amounts. However, I think, given our experience thus far in the 3 years of the program, I don't think there would be a harm to the utility if they had more than, that admissional amount. If they had to deal with a number of projects in year 1, I think, and they can address this, I think they can handle the interconnection process for these smaller systems. So I don't think there's a technical need to hold that out. There is a possibility that we'd get a rush and we'd use up, for example, in the PEPCO service territory, if there might be 33 50 kilowatt systems that apply right away. I think I would view that as a success, and that attracting those smaller systems, so we would have those in the pilot as early on in order to study them. So we did not propose an apportionment of those, with the idea being that these would be the type C small customer who would be building a community solar with a small group of neighbors or family members. So we were not anticipating a regulatory limit or on the number per year. If there was a need to do that for a technical reason, we would like to do that with tariffs.
Mr. Seegers, does that provide clarification? We won't handle that here, but in a tariff.
Just so I understand it, when you say you're going to handle it in utility tariffs, does that mean that we're going to handle it on a utility by utility basis, or is there not going to be like a uniform way of handling the amount?
Ideally, it would be consistent amongst the utilities, whatever we determine, but it could be case by case.
Okay.
Just so OPC understands what's being proposed, perhaps the wording it should be reworded to say an electric company shall accept an additional total of 0 point. And that way, when it comes time to do the tariffs, it's clear that it's uniform amongst all the utilities. Because wasn't one of the questions whether this was going to be split up amongst the years, and what you're saying is that wouldn't be the case. We're going to accomplish it by tariff provision.
I think perhaps you could clarify. If we mean 0.05% of each utility's capacity, not each utility shall accept 0.05% of the entire statewide. I kind of thought that was implied, but we could clarify that you would add.
Shall accept an additional 0.05% of each utility's 2015 capacity?
Yes, Your Honor. If that provides a clarification.
It's, because we have electric company at the beginning of its. Okay.
But I thought I heard, was that your issue, Mr. Seegers, or was your issue that you're wondering whether somebody, if you had a bunch of projects all in year 1 and you used it all up, or should you do it over the 4-year period? That was your issue.
That's correct, Commissioner Herman, yes.
And I think what Mr. Vanderheyden said is that we don't have to put that in the regulation per se, but that when you file tariffs in compliance with the regulations, whenever they get finalized, that would be something you could discuss and deal with at that point.
Okay. Yes.
Is that what I heard?
That's correct, Commissioner.
Okay. Is that satisfactory then? That you recognize there's an issue and you'll work with the staff to resolve?
Yes, Commissioner. I don't think we need to make that determination now. We just wanted to tee the issue up. So, yes, we can handle it when we file our tariffs.
Thank you.
Okay,
And Your Honor, if I think if the commission acts to approve this, we'll need to, it'll be 3.25 in order to make that correct with the rest of the numbers.
right, whatever conforming changes that result from the 3.0 to 3.2 will need to be reflected, so we'll have to be careful of how we do that. Okay, moving along.
All right. Okay, so we have, yes, okay, yeah, I understand. All right, so moving on, we are coming to slide 11. This is a housekeeping change. The original text says paragraph, but does not address the fact that some of this is provided within subparagraphs. So in order to clarify, this was just a housekeeping change we're requesting.
Okay, any objections? Thank you.
Does CCSA have something here?
Not
Oh, okay, but they had a definition. Okay.
All right, shall I proceed?
Please.
All right, this is going to be another area where we'll probably have to spend some time making discussion. The concern that staff has regarding LMI participation is driving this. This is not a requirement of SB 520. This is something that I think the working group has had some opportunity to discuss. Originally, when staff proposed regulations, there was a desire on staff that we proposed with the working group to recognizing the fact that the LMI categories, and I'll show you the table below there on slide 12. This is showing the percent of uncommitted capacity within each of the projects, as best I could gather from the information provided on the utilities websites. The LMI category on the far right, there in many cases there is very little activity in PEPCO and BG&E, and I think this is a known issue that relates to the expense associated with constructing in those service territories because of the density and the cost of land, I think is generally what we're experiencing. So the information that I pulled from the websites just this morning, I believe is the most up-to-date. I will, with the caveat, I was not able to access the Delmarva information. I believe that they are almost fully used up, so the 0% are, I believe, a good estimate. So in particular, PEPCO is not showing any LMI projects for each of the first 2 years. It's my understanding there may be a project that is working its way through the system, but it's not significant to use up the capacity even to the level of where BG&E is using, and BG&E has 56% of their capacity uncommitted. So I mean, it's a known problem. It's not anybody's fault. I think it's just a characteristic that we have in Maryland. There are certain areas where land is cheap, and that's where you want to build your project. When we proposed this to the working group, there are a number of the developers who say, hey, well, don't take away the LMI carve-out because we need that. We are going to be building these projects. It's just taking us longer to develop. So the staff, upon hearing that, withdrew that element. We originally had proposed to just incorporate some proportion of LMI capacity within the open category, remove the LMI category, and then leave the small brownfield and other category in order to capture the construction on brownfields and some of the co-location things that are benefited there. We heard what the working group members said, and so they basically said, look, we need more time, and that seemed reasonable. What we're suggesting here, though, is that there is still a need to encourage that LMI development, which we're going to leaving for that category, but we would like to try requiring 5% of the subscriptions within the open category to be served to the LMI customers as a means of making sure that there are those customers being served within the service territories of all the companies in Maryland. So there is our understanding that and some of the objections we have heard regarding incorporating that within the open category is that it will kind of encumber the development of those projects. It may be more difficult for those projects to be sold to operators who will then need to essentially acquire LMI customers, which in some cases, unless you're kind of prepared to do that as a sales organization or you're focusing on that, perhaps that's something that's more difficult to do. I won't get into the verification issue because you will see that in front of you in January at the admin. So this is something that we're concerned about. We think the Commission has indicated in the past there's the desire to make sure that those benefits are flowing to those customers. This is one way to do it. We understand that many of the developers do not think that this is an approach. It has been cited to us that this was attempted in Colorado, and ultimately, although it was originally approved by their commission as part of their rulemaking, they moved away from that and went to a sort of a portfolio approach where you had to have a certain number of customers within your portfolio. I read the report that was provided to us by the working group members. I think there's some evidence in our project, in the projects in Maryland, that indicate that while it is perhaps a problem, Maryland already has a number of projects that are signing on to provide up to 30%. So it seems to me that it's possible our development is more familiar with that hurdle, and that the 5% wouldn't be a significantly heavy lift. So that is what we're proposing. It's something that we believe will be helpful to the program, and based on our evaluation of where we stand with the current number of projects, it's necessary to take our two largest service territories and increase the LMI participation.
Thank you. Do parties have responses to Mr. Vanderheyden? I see people approaching. Mr. Werner.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Again, my name is Greg Werner from Nexamp. Regarding this 5% LMI requirement in the open category, as CCSA stated in our filing, there are three problems with this. First of all, this was never actually vetted within the working group as a standalone proposal. Rather, it was floated as a compromise solution if the LMI category was eliminated altogether, but it was never floated as a standalone proposal. And therefore, it obviously does not have consensus support among the working group. Second, the 5% figure is actually so low that, at least as Mr. Vanderheyden mentioned, in the case of the Colorado's program, developers actually elected to simply forego the 5% revenue entirely, rather than take on the administrative burden of administering that 5% LMI portion of their customer base. And third, it complicates the financing of the entire open category, placing a burden on developers who don't have the expertise to handle such an LMI requirement and the financing complications that go with it. Lastly, as a practical matter, Nexamp, in fact, has our first project that I mentioned, Chester Woods Point in Delmarva Territory, is an SBO project, so and it qualified by virtue of achieving a 51% LMI component. Based on our experience and the feedback from our actual Maryland customers, we estimate that a typical pool of community solar customers without any targeted marketing efforts will organically include more than 10% LMI. While we share the Commission's goal of ensuring strong LMI participation in the program, there are currently other categories designed to do this, and the addition of the 5% requirement would not aid the Commission's goal, but would create a significant additional administrative burden and a disincentive for many of those projects. Lastly, I'll just note again, the SBO category has an LMI subcategory within it. There's at least one project, ours, that has elected to use the LMI, that LMI subcategory to qualify for that category. So I would say it's too early to say that there is not enough LMI participation. There's actually more. Our project is more than was initially anticipated in the program. Thank you.
Mr. Warner, you said your projects naturally or organically attract 10% LMI. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, if you simply market to a broad swath of customers, using all the typical marketing techniques, in-person marketing, mailers, online advertising, you naturally attract just a general cross-section of the population, which naturally includes greater than 10% LMI.
Is that your personal Nexium's experience, or is that
Correct.
supported? Okay, that's
That
your
is our own
experience.
experience.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Miller, it looks like you want to speak.
Yes, sir. Thank you. My name is Susan Miller, and I work with Earth Justice as a clean energy attorney. In my capacity, I represent a number of low and moderate income advocacy groups. One of the collaboratives I represent involves Montgomery County Green Bank, Baltimore Shines, Maryland Sun, and the Climate Access Fund. What this collaborative is trying to do is create a permanent low and moderate income market for community solar and rooftop solar. We honestly believe that this proposal by staff would harm that market. As the gentleman mentioned, they tried this in Colorado, and what the open category essentially did in Colorado is give free subscriptions to low and moderate income people to meet their 5%. That does not form a market. What we want to do is to form a market that can continue once this pilot is completed. We believe that the 30% carve-out, when I was working on the regs with everyone else at the beginning, Colorado had already done this, so it was recognized. And the low and moderate income advocates did not want it then, because they recognized that it did not form a permanent market. That's why we advocated for the 30% carve-out. We believe the 30% carve-out ultimately will work, has started to work. There are concerns, and that is part of the reason the legislature extended the pilot, was to enable that market, which takes longer, to form. So we think this is actually contrary to the ultimate forming of a permanent low and moderate income market. Thank you.
Ms. Miller, can I ask you, do you think that the market will form in the PEPCO and BG&E service territories? Because it hasn't shown much life.
It hasn't. There's two problems. One is the income verification issue, which you will discuss, and that's a problem that needs to be resolved in order for the market to move forward exponentially. BG market has just started to pick up with regard to low income, and we think it will. The gentleman behind me proposed another proposal to help the PEPCO market, and we believe that these markets will develop. They just take more time because the financing issues are more difficult, and other factors of signing people up and things like that. But we're working very diligently to help this market form, and we believe it will.
Thank you.
Does the gentleman standing have comments? Yes. Please state and spell your name.
Yes, my name is John Forgash, JOHNFORGASH. I'm here on behalf of Soul Harvest Energy. We're a consultancy and development company, interest over 100 megawatts of solar in Maryland. We've also helped on some early stage development efforts on those projects as well throughout the state, both utility scale and community solar projects. And as Susan mentioned, we are also not in support of the staff's proposal for the 5% for open projects. We have submitted comments, though, to ask the commission to approve language under the co-location section that would allow for co-location of LMI projects of up to 6 megawatts in the PEPCO service territory, based on the fact that there have not been any LMI projects that have asked for program capacity during the first 2.5 years of this program. And we believe that the siting aspect of this change will help to drive more LMI than just a 5% increase or requirement by open projects, based on the fact that siting's already constrained in the PEPCO territory, and for the fact that by co-locating projects, it may give the LMI projects and the project developers additional incentive to develop multiple projects on a property that would potentially help the economics of that group of projects as a whole.
Would your proposal envision a CPCM process for said projects?
It would not.
So the problem that it creates is you have this big facility that bypasses all the CPCN protections for the citizens in that area. That's a big problem.
Correct.
Okay.
They still would be, of course, the projects would still be required to obtain various approvals within Montgomery County and also within Prince George's County.
Understood.
To go through those processes.
I understood.
There's public hearings and that sort of thing.
Understood, but the very formal, precise protections of a CPCM process are bypassed.
Thank you, Mr. Forgash. I took a look at your proposal to not to exceed six megawatts. It would be utility territory specific for just PEPCO. I don't know how many regulations we have that carve it out just for a utility. I'm wondering, Mr. Seegers, do you have any response to that proposal?
We did look at that, Your Honor. We did not have any objection to that proposal.
I am concerned with respect to what Commissioner O'Donnell just referenced with regard to our CPCN and exemptions for CSEGs. This would be a much larger one, co-located.
And currently, right now, as far as co-location exemptions are concerned, the LMI is the only premium type of project right now that's not offered that type of co-location status. Whereas carports are, carports are provided that opportunity as well, in terms of all the other premium projects that are also available through this program. So I think that's one issue to consider as well, in terms of whether or not the co-location would be a potential solution to the problem that currently exists in PEPCO.
Do we have any input from the counties, Montgomery County and Prince George's County, on your recommendation, on your proposal?
We do not at this time. But of course, there has been discussions about multiple counties moving forward with co-locating on brownfields and landfills, which has already taken place, and that conversation continues. So in terms of the group of stakeholders that came together to sign this letter and to sign these comments, I believe there's support for a co-location effort of LMI to help provide a shot in the arm for those types of projects in an area where siting is very difficult. Thank you.
Any additional comments from the parties on the Soul Harvest proposal?
Mr. Chairman, OPC at this time would object to the proposal. We actually have discussed this issue in the net metering work group, and while we are supporters of LMI participation, we are concerned about the fact that this would only apply in PEPCO service territory. I'd also note that one of the things that all of the existing categories for this co-location exception is that the parcels of land don't really have another economical use, whereas this one would essentially be adding a co-location exception to somehow encourage LMI development, and it's not entirely clear to OPC why that would be the case, at least based on the reasons that Soul Harvest and the additional parties that signed on to a Soul Harvest proposal included in their comments. So while we are open to continue to discuss this co-location exception, we would recommend that the Commission not adopt it at this time.
Thank you. Was this proposal from Soul Harvest discussed in the work group?
It was not discussed in the discussions that we had right before staff's filing. This was brought up, I believe, on 2 or 3 separate calls, perhaps a year or more ago.
Okay. Is that true, Mr. Forgash?
It was. We did speak about it briefly on one call about a month and a half ago, something that.
Okay. If I could move to Mr. Vanderheyden, there's some criticism of your proposal because it wasn't vetted through the work group. Is there a reason why?
Your Honor, I think I might take a little objection. It wasn't vetted. We brought a proposal that would have altered the categories to remove the LMI in response to the concerns to be able to continue to develop LMI projects from the folks who are kind of depending on that carve out. We essentially considered that. I would say that we did not. It's true that we did not submit these these regs that had this solely to the working group. That's correct. But I think as part of the discussion, it was our intent to convey that we were backing away from that, but would retain a 5% amount in the open category.
Do commissioners have questions on this topic before we take a vote and move to a break?
There's no tie to the legislation, right? There's no statutory requirement that we address this.
There is not.
All right, thank you.
I support staff on this proposal to create the 5% LMI carve-out for years 4 through 7. I recognize that it'll put a burden on some of the developers in terms of outreach and additional costs, but we have a glaring problem as indicated by the data on the screen here, and I believe we should give it a try. Nothing else has seemed to work up until this point. I know there was a Colorado example cited and how that carve-out did not work. I think our experiences have been somewhat different than other states. I can't say I know what occurred in Colorado, but I am comfortable at this point with supporting staff's position. Commissioner Richard.
I do not support staff's position. Definitely in favor of the goal of trying to increase the participation. I think that's essential. It's part of the legislative mandate of this program. However, we do have a low to moderate income work group right now, and they're working on doing addressing just those issues, particularly on the verification. So I think this would be premature to do something like this before we have resolved how we're going to verify the participants. I would hope what comes out of this is we're helping the program, not adding an additional burden. And I'm afraid that if we accept staff on this, we will be adding an additional burden on parts of the program that are currently working.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
I'm a little torn on this, to be honest with you, Mr. Chairman. I see the need to try to foster the LMI participation in these programs, and of course we have a gap that needs to be filled. So the effort is appreciated, but I'm persuaded by Mr. Warner's argument from CCSA that the uncertainty added to the financing arrangements may be a little bit too much, and so I think that's going to be the part of the argument that's going to bring me down on the side of not supporting this change at this time.
Commissioner Linton.
I would agree with Commissioners Richard and O'Donnell. I would not support this change at this time. I do think it's important to extend these programs to all citizens of the state, not just LMI, of course. But I've heard, and we've heard over the first 3 years of the many challenges with verification of LMI eligibility, and that's an issue that we need to address it in some way in order to make this part of the program more effective. So I think I agree with Commissioner Richard, we're still a little early in that point.
Thank you. Commissioner Herman.
I agree with the majority. I'm convinced that we have a number of low-income customer advocates here who are not in favor of this, and I believe that they as well as the staff have the best interests of the low-income customers in mind, and their opinions, I think, are important to take into account here, and that while I encourage the staff and all the parties to continue to try to work together to move towards a higher low-income participation in these projects. So I really appreciate the goal. I'm persuaded by the low-income advocates on this one.
Staff's proposal does not carry. We're going to take a 12-minute recess, reconvene at 3:10. Okay, we're back on the record. Mr. Vanderheyden, where did we last leave off? On slide 13?
Slide 13 is the next one, Your Honor. This is a housekeeping change. We realize that when you read this, a customer doesn't necessarily imply someone as a subscriber. We're referring specifically to folks who are subscribing to the project, so we're removing customers and replacing with subscribers.
Okay. Any objection from the parties or the commission? Commissioner Linton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not an objection, just a request for quick clarification. In the dispute resolution section 2032, do we refer to the ability to file a complaint there as a subscriber or customer? I think it's subscriber, but I haven't checked to make sure.
I don't know. We'll have to check, and that might be something, if it's not consistent, we'll need to correct it. But typically, to distinguish a subscriber who has a contract with a community solar organization, we need to use that word. We need to use subscriber.
Okay. We did incorporate the ability in the regulation the first time, so I just wanted to make sure we maintain it when we make this change. That's all. Thank you.
And as we proceed, as Mr. Vanderheyden proceeds through his presentation, once again, a reminder to parties, if you have a proposal that is either on point or we're going to pass by, that's your opportunity to speak up. Okay, so slide 14.
Yes, Your Honor. This is the first two changes highlighted there. The 3.0, consistent with your decision with the capacity, that needs to be 3.25. And then so that language would be adjusted from what we filed. And then the on O2A 4C, we are adding of this chapter to make sure that folks understand that the regulation is referring to the Chapter 2 Regulation O2.
Any objections or comments? None.
On slide 15, this is caused by the extension of the program to 7 years. So there was a need to essentially reallocate capacity in the second year for the third year, which would have been the last year. But now that the seventh year is the last year, we need to make alterations to that to just bring it up to the new length.
What happens if there's excess capacity in the sixth year? Excuse me, the fifth year.
In the fifth year, the capacity is staying in the category. This is addressing if you get to the end of the program and you have, let's say the LMI category is sitting there and none of its capacity has been used or not enough of it's been used. If it were to remain in that category in the last year of the program, it would be unavailable, and so the entire community solar cap would have these stranded amounts that remain in category.
Let me try to ask it a different way. I must not be asking my questions very clearly today. Does excess capacity in the fourth year roll over to the fifth year, and then excess capacity in the fifth year roll over to the sixth year?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Thank you. I must have asked it better at that time.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
The Excellent Utilities didn't have an objection to this change, but in our comments we did raise, once again, a question about how it's to be interpreted, and it's essentially in two parts. The first of which is that the language says that the capacity is to be allocated on a pro rata basis. I know there's been some discussion in the working group on what that means, but we never really landed on what exactly, what pro rata means. And another question that came up during the working group is, does this requirement apply if there is remaining capacity in each of the categories at the end of year 6? This came up because, for example, in the PEPCO program at the end of year 2, we had remaining capacity available in each of the categories. And the way the language is drafted, where it says that it is to be allocated on a pro rata basis to the other categories, it seems to suggest that that it would only apply if a particular category was full. So once again, we're just looking for some guidance or some clarification on those 2 points as to how this is to be interpreted.
Well, the pro rata language is not new. Has it caused confusion in the past?
It has not, because we haven't had to deal with the issue yet, Your Honor. We, at the end of year 2, that's when this issue came up.
So we could foresee a problem or at least confusion as the program is lengthened. I'll look to staff once again to see if there's any clarification on that term.
Your Honor, we have not kind of thought about how we would apply it. Mr. Seegers is correct in that there's somewhat of an implication here that you would have a category that is completely used up, and then you would essentially need to allocate from another category. So, for example, if the open category is entirely used up at the end of the second to last year, the implication is that you need to move capacity from say the LMI category into the open category. There is and that would be more clear if there was none available in one of the categories, and then the remaining capacity could be moved to it, so it could be made used. I think we would want to, again, address this through the tariffs. This issue will come in front of you because staff has asked for you to waive this, because we don't think these regs will be effective until we proceed with the rulemaking. And in order to begin allocating for year 3, there is a desire to not move anything out of a category. So that is one of the items that staff had asked you to waive, and I believe that's scheduled for an admin coming up.
Right, so those will be before us before this regulation is promulgated.
Yes, we'll need to address that so we can essentially proceed with year 3. I don't know that I'd want to be more specific with the language here. I think we would use the tariffs to be precisely clear as to how we're going to allocate, and then at that point we would address the situation, how the pro rata calculation would be done.
Should we keep the term pro rata? Or just allocate it on a basis to other categories and we determine the basis on a case by case?
To tell you the truth, I haven't evaluated whether or not it should be removed. I think it has a meaning that would imply that there'd be some proportional split, and I think it's helpful to retain that, because otherwise some basis could be, well, we decided we wanted everything to go to the open category. This is implying that there's going to be a recognition of the original capacities that were allocated, and that we'd somehow be reflecting that in how the unused capacity would be split between the 2 that needed capacity, assuming it was 2. If it was just 1 that needed capacity, perhaps that wouldn't be as much of an issue. But I think we'd have to kind of sit through we have to sit through this calculation. What if it's like this? What if it's like that, to figure that out, and then develop, I don't want to say an algorithm, but like some wording in the tariff that clarifies how that pro rata calculation would be developed.
All right, Mr. Seegers, you're not getting the clarification you seek today, but it appears that you will before the commission long before this regulation takes effect.
Understood, Your Honor. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, CCSA does have some comments on this, if you would. This was an issue that was addressed in CCSA's comments, and CCSA made an alternative wording change to this that I think provides complete clarity in that. And it would be, actually we have some slides here, but I'm not quite sure how to make them appear as opposed to Phil's.
I don't believe we'd be able to have 2. Oh, you can? Okay.
If I just click this thing here,
you could toggle.
I can toggle here.
And for those of you who are looking at CCSA's proposals on page 4.
Yeah. Okay. I think it's this one. Right. So in that section, CCSA recommended clarifying that if there was any unused capacity in any year, that would simply be carried forward all the way along to the end of the program in its original category. So that's simple. No reallocation until the last year of the pilot, just like the current allocation was only going to take place in the last year of the pilot. And then for simplicity, at the very end, allocate all any unused capacity that would exist to the open category, since that tends to be the category that is most highly used and would have the least extra capacity in that category. So I think from the utility standpoint, it provides complete clarity on how the mechanics are supposed to work. I would say, Mr. Chairman, that my experience in the working group discussions has been that when the question was raised of how the allocation would be done in year 3, this pro rata language is very confusing. If you have multiple categories that don't have full capacity utilization, how do you pro rata allocate back and forth between those categories? There was never any answer that anyone had. The issue which will be before you in January almost kind of punted the issue because it said, we won't do any reallocations in year 3. We'll just keep everything in the same category. So it really doesn't ask you to resolve the mechanics of the problem. It just says, well, don't worry about it, for year 3. So we think it would be useful to have the mechanics clearly understood because it was a subject of confusion. And the idea of putting it all into the open category is just to make sure at a high level that there's an opportunity to get the maximum benefit out of whatever is in the development pipeline at the end of the program to meet the broader needs, to install solar in the state in accordance with the RPS, just to let everything wash up into the category with the fewest restrictions to make the most use of all the program capacity. So we think that this fixes the utility problem and brings some clarity that actually you may not get in January if you answer just the specific question that was brought to you.
Does staff have a response to the proposal?
Yes, Your Honor. I think this creates a problem for us in that it effectively removes the categories from year 7. And again, depending on how projects will be selected in year 7, if there is a wait list that we start, perhaps at year 4 and it goes all the way through, if there is development of, say, LMI projects, like let's say an LMI developer realizes that Maryland's is something they can work in, or perhaps a source of funding shows up, it looks like that what this would do is it'd say, all right, well, since you haven't shown up prior to, through the end of year 6, all of the capacity is going to be allocated to the open category, and there's a whole line of folks on that waiting list to build projects, so they will essentially have no ability to use the LMI category in year 7 in its entirety. I think possibly we might be able to look at what would happen if, having completed the program in its entirety, getting all the way to the end of year 7, so that there are no new applications coming in for LMI customers or LMI projects. If there's a waiting list for open that, before the year closes out, and it would have to be perhaps an action that would be taken in the last 30 days of the year, then any unused capacity. But essentially, the way this is written, I think what it would do is say, we're not going to have an LMI category or an SBO category in year 7, which would perhaps preclude someone who said, hey, well, I just got here, or we've been trying to get financing to apply for an SBO or an LMI project, but we're precluded from participating in the 7th year. And as one of the things we've heard already from some of the developers, it just takes a while to get the projects prepared to be in development. So I would recommend that the commission didn't accept this because of the concern about essentially taking that capacity away at the end of the program, but before that last year is rolled out.
So what if we were to allow everything to roll in its category into year 7 by default, as you just suggested, I think, but the commission could have the latitude by regulation to transfer capacity to other categories when good cause is shown. That gives you the flexibility, keeps everything there, keeps waiting queues lined up. But if it makes sense and someone makes a filing that says we want to transfer this capacity to another category and here's why, and we consider it makes good sense, why not?
That would provide a lot of flexibility, and that would be a good idea, I think.
Just a thought.
So, Mr. Warren, your language moves everything to the open category for the final program year, correct?
Well, again, any unused capacity from prior years that's rolling forward. So maybe just one minor thought on Phil's comment was that I don't think it touches anything in program capacity that's allocated to categories in year 7. It just says that any of the unused stuff up to that point in time would roll over. And I'd also point out that, I mean, if there were projects in the queue if there were projects that were looking to take advantage of that capacity, the capacity would still be in the program. It would just be that it would have those restrictions removed. And
So, do we need a, Mr. Vanderhayden, Mr. Warren's proposal has an A and a B. The B is about the 6th year, but he's also got an A. Do we need the A?
I'm having a little trouble reading that from here.
Can you read it from there?
It's on your left. Up there.
It's all right. Much better. I didn't even know that was there. You're
Yeah.
right. Actually, I did, but.
I don't think we do. Isn't that what happens anyway?
I think he's. I mean, if you took it away, we were already
You're already
going to
doing
do that.
Yeah.
And I think again that might be something that you use the tariffs to do.
I think that you do need it because
Do you think that we do need it? I'm just trying to understand because they're two separate issues here. So do we need A?
I think A is, if you look at what CCSA has submitted, they essentially crossed out 5 and then added. They split up what was now portrayed as sections 5 and 6 into 5A and 5B. But I think you do need existing 5 or 5A in CCSA's proposal because it explains what happens to the unused capacity prior to that final year.
And we don't have that. Where
I don't believe that is.
That's not spelled out in
I don't-
existing regulations.
I don't believe so.
Okay, so is there consensus from the parties that that's useful, that A is useful and
clear.
appropriate?
I think so, Your Honor.
Yeah, I think we think it's useful just to make it clear how
Make
it
it clear.
carries.
Okay.
Yeah, it's clear.
So now, okay, so we got A, and B. Mr. Chairman, I'm not prepared at this time to absolutely allocate to the open category yet, and I think that therefore I would not want to adopt B. Maybe in year 5 we'll see where things are and we'll be able to make an assessment at that point. But I'm not prepared to definitively rule what would happen in year 7 at this time. That's just my opinion.
Mr. Chairman, I would actually support the flexibility approach that Commissioner O'Donnell has suggested. This is a pilot program, so to the extent we are looking to learn, we need to be responsive to anything that's happening as part of the pilot. I mean, the pilot will teach us some information along the way, and so if we see that there's a category that is there's a lot of interest in it, and we have capacity in another category doesn't have that same interest, and we ought to be able to have the flexibility without going through the process of a COMAR change to respond.
Commissioner Linton, if we do adopt Commissioner O'Donnell's proposed language, and I know we're still working that out, would that attach to the CCSA proposal 5A or staff's proposal, which is, I guess, 6, unused category capacity, where staff was just changing
Yeah, staff just changed the board.
the years.
The years, right. And then you still have the pro rata language there, which I know is, I think if we inserted our flexibility to make a change in the regulation, that's the same thing as the pro rata. We become the pro rata.
So would staff have any concern if we adopt CCSA's proposal, which is just the 5A language, which replaces your 6, and add Commissioner O'Donnell's, for lack of a better term, flexibility language? Good cause.
Your Honor, I think you would have to change the any year, and I think I wrote down what Commissioner O'Donnell stated, but if you'd have to clarify if so in reading from A, if a category listed in A3 of this regulation has unused capacity, at the end of would have to be years, perhaps 3 through 6 or something of that nature. then it would be carried forward to be clear that
It's prospective.
it's right. And then if the B would be capacity that has remained unused following the 6th year may be transferred from one category to another by the commission for good cause shown, or something to that effect. But I think if what you were trying to convey is that transfer would occur at the end of the 6th year, it would imply that we're going to keep the categories throughout the program, and then the commission would have the option, but wouldn't be required to do so, to reallocate capacity at the end, unless, Commissioner O'Donnell, you meant to just say that would be something the commission would do at any time during the program, in which case...
No, it's not. Clearly, it's not. So the way I would do this, Mr. Chairman, is keep A as proposed by CCSA and take B and truncate it where it says reallocated to open. Take that out. So you'd restate the same language, that it would carry forward to the same program category, and then you add another sentence that it can be transferred in that year, in the 7th year, to another category upon good cause shown to the commission, with commission approval, is really what I was trying to say. So default stays in the same category in the last year of the program or the pilot, and if you show good cause and it needs to be transferred to another category, you can do that under a rewritten B.
So would B now read, capacity that has remained unused following the 6th year shall be reallocated to the same category in the 7th year.
It just says it shall carry over to the same category.
In the 7th year.
In the 7th year.
Unless-
Another sentence, or unless upon good cause shown to the commission for reallocation.
Yeah, a comma, unless upon.
Can we change the shall to may?
Yes.
No need binding ourselves, you know.
Let me try to read that one last time. Capacity that has remained unused following the 6th year may carry over.
That would be shall.
Shall carry over to the same category in the 7th year, comma, unless upon good cause shown to the commission.
So, just to, I agree with all of that, but I think if you leave the word any, then it carries forward in the same capacity, in the same category, which would apply to the 6th year into the 7th, and then B could simply say capacity that remained unused following the 6th year may be reallocated upon good cause shown.
Yeah.
Right? Does that do it?
That works for me.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Mr. Warren, does that, for me, I just want to make sure we don't leave any capacity on the table at the end of the program, and if we have other good projects that we can easily transfer that capacity.
Yeah. I feel a CCSA member coming up behind me who may have a viewpoint on that, and then I'll respond. I'd be happy to respond to your question as well, Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Warren. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As with Nexamp, having had experience with exactly this issue in Potomac Edison territory, I can say that I appreciate Commissioner O'Donnell's desire to have flexibility for how to handle this in year 7. Unfortunately for us developers, we need to have visibility at least 2 years in advance on what capacity is going to be available. So the flexibility does not actually, I don't think it's going to achieve the result that you might be imagining, because developers are planning projects, devoting resources to territories and all that stuff multiple years in advance. And there's, as an industry, as a developer, there's a need to have visibility in years going forward. So I think to Mr. Seeger's point, it would almost be better to simply have clarity that he was asking for, rather than the flexibility that's being discussed right now. I should add, I'm only speaking for Nexamp in this capacity.
Let me ask you a question on that.
Sure.
How are you going to know in year 5 what the excess capacity is going to be in year 7 to give you that certainty that you say you need? How are you going to know? You're not gonna know what's gonna be left out there.
It's a gamble. You have to watch. You keep close track of what other developers are doing. You watch the market, but this is something that we devote a lot of time and energy to doing. And these risks are what we manage on. That's as part of our business.
Yeah, I'm not disputing you know your business. I'm just not seeing how certain you are making planning development decisions based on a completely unknown. It's going to be unknown. You can't know that. If you knew it, you could just adjust them, as you went along.
I think it adds I agree that it is uncertain, but it adds another layer of uncertainty to have to go before the commission to ask that capacity be moved rather than knowing in advance that it's going to be moved.
I'm willing to withdraw my suggestion, Mr. Chairman. There's enough uncertainty here, and I'm just going to withdraw my suggestion. But I'm not buying the arguments. So I think we could clear this up now. We're back. I think if I withdraw my suggestion, we're back to Mr. Seeger needing clarification on what pro rata means.
Well, I will adopt your suggestion if you withdraw your suggestion. Because it's in my opinion, if there's concern that there's too much flexibility, the request can be made in year 5 as opposed to year 6. I mean, if our regulation simply says that the request needs to be made and good cause needs to be shown, and that can be done at any time and in whatever way it needs to be done. If there's good cause, there's good cause.
Commissioner Linton, can you, having adopted Commissioner O'Donnell's discarded proposal, we still have the concern with the term any. I don't know if by making it a future year of the program, so it's not obviously retroactive. Can you recite the proposal? I guess that we're still off of CCSA's A.
Right, I was adopting the same one, so
it's still
we would have to say the year 5 of the program. If you're looking to make sure that by year 7 we're not leaving anything on the table, as we suggested earlier, and the industry looks at least 2 years out to make their projections as to whether or not they would like to move forward with a project, then that puts us in year 5. And if good cause exists at that time, we see that there's trends that suggest that we'll have open capacity in a particular category, we can take action at that point.
And what are we doing with respect to B?
That becomes the new B, right?
Well, if we still need the B, we can we changed it 6th year to 5th year, and the rest of it, the 5th year may be reallocated upon good cause shown. May be reallocated by the commission upon good cause shown.
So my concern with that is that in year 5, we get a lot of applications to just go everything to open. And that's a concern, that we may get premature applications for year 5. So with respect to Commissioner O'Donnell's prior suggestion, I think that I would just stick with the following the 6th year may be reallocated upon good cause shown, and then just leave it at that. And if somebody has a question in year 5, they could always make a filing and ask for a waiver or something like that. But I wouldn't want to invite a lot of filings, moving everything to open in year 5, and that's my concern.
So Commissioner Herman, you would keep it at the 5th or the 6th year? The 5th?
The 6th.
The 6th.
I would keep it at the 6th, and that way, because at the 5th, then we end up with 2 years of applications for everything going to open. and, you know, that's not, I don't think that's consistent with the intent of the program to try to, you know, cross all these categories, so.
So your proposal would be the capacity that has remained unused following the 6th year shall be,
May be reallocated upon good cause shown.
may be reallocated upon good cause shown.
Reallocated by the commission. I
Oh,
guess that doesn't need to be said.
That's fine, yeah, that's fine. And then if the any causes problems because of prior years, although of course it couldn't take effect until it actually takes effect. So under A, if you wanted to put years 3 through 7, you know, that's okay too. I'm indifferent on that one because I'm not sure it's necessary, but if you think it's important, if staff thinks it's important, I don't have a problem with that.
If I may, I think the reason why the change was made is because when it was only a 3-year program, this would only have come up between the second and third year, meaning that was the last chance to do anything with this capacity. I do think that any is consistent with what was initially included as far as the electric company capacity in each year, which remains unused by projects, shall be added to the capacity the following year. If we go with CCSA's language, I think leaving it as is, including the word any, accomplishes the same thing.
Okay, so I believe this is the proposal on the table, is to adopt the CCSA proposal, which is now 5A, as proposed. 5B would state capacity that has remained unused following the 5th year. 6th year. May be reallocated by the commission upon good cause shown.
Yes.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. It's my proposal, so I'm aye.
The proposed regulation is adopted.
The orphan proposal.
All right.
Someone's adopting it.
What do we have next?
So I think we're up to slide 16 on the staff proposal.
You need to toggle back.
And I know, I believe Exelon has a comment on this, but Mr. Vanderheyden, why don't you explain?
All this is doing is removing the 350 count per project limit per the removal of that language in the legislation.
Thank you. Mr. Seegers.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. We certainly understand what the intent of this proposal is, but there may be a potential conflict between what would be sections A and the new section B. As we explained in our comments, the language about how as many accounts as needed to match each CSEGS capacity, it doesn't comport with how subscriptions on community solar projects are obtained, because the subscriptions are based on a percentage of kWh output rather than a kW capacity. And if the electric company elects to require a subscriber organization to maintain a minimum average subscription size of 2 kilowatts per customer, which each of the Exelon utilities have, that it would effectively limit a project of 2 megawatts to about 1,000 customers, in the sense that you could have one really big customer and then a whole bunch of smaller ones. It only has to be, each customer only has to have an average of the 2 kW size. So there is a potential conflict in the language here. Unfortunately, I'm not sure how to address that, but we did want to raise it for the commission and everyone else's consideration.
But you don't have a solution to your conflict.
Unfortunately, as many accounts as needed.
Subject to the provisions of.
Your Honor, I think the only solution, if that is the concern, is to remove the subscription limit, which I don't think is a good idea. It's possible to lower it so that this becomes kind of a very unlikely probability. But he's correct. If you have 2,000 kilowatts and you have a 2 kilowatt minimum subscription, you basically have sort of created, without actually doing it, an effective 1,000 is the most you can have out of 2 megawatts. If everyone has an average of 2 kilowatts. But the fact that that B addresses the average being 2 kilowatts, it's not a you must have 2 kilowatts. And at the same time, I don't know if this would ever happen, but if you remove that, someone, for some reason might have like micro subscriptions and have, many, many more subscriptions than we ever thought because, there perhaps some activity taken to take multiple subscriptions and combine them together in some way. So I think at this point, especially for the pilot, we want to maintain some level of a minimum subscription size, in this case an average. Staff thought about this for a while, just trying to go back and forth. We did not come up with a way to address what Mr. Siegers is suggesting without eliminating B, because I think that mathematically you run into that problem. At the same time, the 350 account limit was basically something put in place to limit the amount of processing. So, conceivably, as that's no longer an issue, many of them moved to automation, or they've simply developed the means to handle more than that. By removing it, we definitely have to remove the 350. The question is to whether or not the 2 kilowatt minimum. I think possibly if we came to that, I would leave it in place. And if we came to a conflict about it, we'd have to perhaps ask for a waiver till we resolved it. But I don't think you want to have, like a 500 watt subscription, or perhaps even something smaller than that, be a possibility.
No, I don't think we could protect against every eventuality here. If we have a situation that comes up as envisioned, I think it's a good question for us to consider. I don't see a fix obvious right now.
We may actually have one, Your Honor. We certainly agree with Mr. Vanderheyden that we are not proposing to get rid of the 2 kW average size limit. What we might be able to do is just modify A, add a comma after the CSCGC's capacity, subject to the limitation in subsection B.
That would seem to address the concern.
Seems the easiest way to do so, Your Honor.
We are discussing as to whether or not the language of the legislation, which says "but no limit," if this is implying that there is a limit, are we now creating a regulation that is in conflict with that?
Very good point.
Yeah.
So the legislation explicitly states that we are not to put a limit on the number of subscribers.
In other words, there's but no limit to the maximum number of subscribers.
Okay. Yeah. With that being the case, we don't want to have a regulation that says subject to the limitations in the regulation below.
Your Honor, if I could address that very briefly. As Mr. Vanderheyden said, the 350 subscriber cap, that was implemented in order to avoid the utilities being overwhelmed by applications and not being able to process it. The way the regulations currently read is that if the utilities have an automated billing process, then there is no limit on the cap. So I think that is what the General Assembly was referring to. I think a project, by its very nature, it can only go up to 2 megawatts. So it naturally is there is going to be a limit on the number of subscribers that can be served from a project. It doesn't have limitless ability to serve customers, Your Honor.
Do you have an additional proposal? I don't feel comfortable now with the citing the statute, including a limitation in A. I do feel that this is an issue that can be addressed at the appropriate time.
Yeah, it would be my view, Mr. Chairman, that I think as drafted by staff, it's sufficient for now, and if a problem comes up, we can deal with it at the time, but that that I think if there is a potential conflict, we can deal with it, but hopefully that won't happen.
Okay.
Just a clarification question. I think I know the answer to this, but the 2 kilowatt per customer, the minimum average subscription size, 2 kilowatt per customer, that's on a billing cycle or monthly basis, correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
Right. So it's not an annual. That would create the micro solution that.
It,
right. Okay.
it would be reflective of the proportion. So if you have 2 megawatt facility, you could have up to 1,000 of those. So 1 divided by 1,000 is the proportion.
Right.
That you would multiply that times the output in kilowatt hours, and that's the amount that gets credited after it's converted to dollars, if that's what you do.
Great. Thank you.
The commission will adopt staff's proposal with respect to this regulation. The next item, please.
Under slide 17, this is just changing year 3 to year 7, reflective of the change in the length of the program. We think it's important that the kilowatt hour output, those records, especially in the records that are going to be applied to each subscriber's account, are kept through the duration of the pilot. We will probably need information like that for the purpose of studying and reporting on the effects of the pilot. So I think there's normally somewhat of a 3-year. We may have had 3 years in there simply because the old pilot length was 3 years, but I think typically utilities must keep billing records for at least 3 years. But in this case, I think we would want to have subscription records for the entire time period of the pilot.
Seeing no concerns, we can move on.
Your Honor, slide 18 is addressing. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Yep. Keep not paying attention to that. All right, slide 18. This is the proposal to double the length of the deadlines for operating. There are 2 deadlines that are being addressed. There's also a kind of a housekeeping change of operation to operational that is not meant to have any change in policy or anything of that nature. But in C1, we have a 12-month. So right now you would get dropped if you didn't provide a deposit, if you haven't become operating within 12 months of being accepted into the program. Once you've provided the deposit that's listed, you would then currently have 18 months to complete your construction. We are doubling both of those. Now it's 24 and 36. Entirely being done in order to hopefully minimize the number of waiver requests we receive for extending operational deadlines.
Thank you. Mr. Seegers?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we have no objection to modifying the timeframes. This would obviously alleviate the number of waiver requests that the Commission has recently seen. We just have 2 questions. The first of which is that would the new timelines apply to projects that are currently accepted into the programs, or would they only apply to projects that are awarded capacity once these regulations become effective? That is our first question. And then the second question is, the statute stipulates that the program is only going to be in effect for 7 years. But if a project comes along and is awarded capacity at the very end of year 7, does that mean that that project will have 36 more months beyond the end of year 7 in order to come into operation? That is just yet another question that we would seek clarification on.
On that question, I believe that yes, once they're in the door, they'll have the 36 months if they're in year 7, whether it be the last day, or so that would carry over another 3 years.
Okay.
I'll confirm with staff and the commissioners. On the earlier question, which was when the regulation takes effect, would it apply retroactively? Is that your question, or projects currently being processed?
Yes, that is our question, Your Honor.
No, I see no reason why the new reg should not apply to those projects currently going through the process. So I hear a groan. So we'll hear from the commissioners as well as staff. Commissioner O'Donnell.
Mr. Chairman, doesn't that become an effective extension for all projects in the pipeline? Right now,
That would be the effect.
yeah, it's like a blanket, to me, that's a blanket waiver, a blanket extension. It almost feels like a windfall to me.
Although,
These folks signed up for this program, they contracted, they got the awards for capacity, knowing the rules. The rules didn't work out, and I'm supportive of changing the rules, but I'm not sure I want to go back and wave a magic wand and say, now you got an extra 2 years. I don't know, I'm not sure that's fair.
so, and I'm not sure that, I'm not sure that's how it would be, because they have a specific document from the commission that says that their operational deadline is X, right? And that they have I believe, do they not have based on what the current rules are, they have pieces of paper, or they have requirements that say, I've got to do it, I've got to be operational by X date. Is that correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
So by extending this, we would not automatically extend those operational dates. They have requirements to meet those operational dates. If they came in and said, I need a waiver, and hey, you already said it was, that would be the appropriate amount of time, we could look at it at that, we could look at that. But if they have a piece of paper that says their operational date is supposed to be June 30th of 2021, I don't think this regulation changes that operational date. Or
So
Ms. Garofalo, I'm curious to hear what you have to say, because if they do have a operational date, why does that date hold if we change the regulation?
Well, this is a tough one for me, because I have a couple of sitting on my desk that would apply, that would love to have additional time, and frankly, we'd love to propose that you give that to them. But I think it would, in answer to part of your question, it would not extend this for everybody. I think the participants in the program do want to get started. They have been out there.
And they have dates from the commission. They have operational they have dates that under which they currently have to operate. Would this regulation automatically extend those dates without them coming in and asking for an extension?
Oh, not with, they would have to come in and ask for an extension.
They would have to come in and ask for an
Absolutely.
extension. That's what I'm getting at. So
Yes.
it's not an automatic extension. If they already have an operational date, they have an operational date
Correct.
from this commission.
But I would say the spirit of this might move some people to come in and ask for that.
Oh,
They
it-
would
You
have to
better
ask for it.
prepare for every single one that's out there to come in here.
It
So
might.
you're gonna be very busy.
It might, but it's not an automatic for people who have
Correct.
current operational
I
dates. That's
agree.
what I wanted to
Yes, absolutely.
make sure that would be the case.
The date in question is the application date. Or the receipt.
Right.
Yeah, so,
So the date that this is affecting is the submission of a completed application, which that's a historical fact that is not being altered. What this is saying is that if, let's say, this is only going to affect a limited number, depending on the timing and when these regs become effective. But the operational date in itself is driven by the date by which the original program the project was submitted. So since we're on kind of an annual schedule where they begin applying for interconnections, that takes a couple of months, and then they're able to, once they receive the interconnection agreement, make application. We started those for year 2 in the October-November timeframe. So someone applied for interconnection in October, they may have received it 2 or 3 months later. We are probably starting to see that the key date would be perhaps a submission date in January, perhaps of 2019. A project that's in the year 2 queue at the moment is going to run into its 12-month probably sometime in January of 2020, and this regulation will not affect when they made their application. But they will first run into their 12-month deadline before these regs go into effect, if they're on that sort of a schedule based on where we are. Something that applies in year 3, presuming we're able to resolve the rolling over categories, those year 3 projects, they're going to be awarded capacity in 2020, and by then, so anything coming up, everything that's going to go into year 3, if these regs go into effect, they will have 24 months from their application date, which we're not changing. So I think we're sort of in between years at the moment. The folks who would benefit might be the situation where if these regs go into effect 18 months or within 18 months of the year 2 projects, they would read this new regulation and say, well, I have 36 months. I paid my deposit, which I actually had to pay at year 12, not at year. Now, someone might come back and say, hey, can I get my deposit back because it hasn't been 2 years? That might happen. But, and we're going to be done, so we'd like our deposit earlier, perhaps.
Okay.
That, there's some issues there. We may have to kind of figure it out.
I see.
What
I
happens,
see.
what happens to the 4 items sitting on Ms. Garofalo's desk, or the 4 items that might be sitting on queue on Mr. Bugelman's desk, waiting to come to Ms. Garofalo's desk?
I guess it's going to depend on the timing of the effective date of these regulations. I mean, at this point, let's say the regulations go into effect in June. That is everything that's on her desk right now needs to be granted a waiver. I think probably before June, or they will fall out of their 18 months. If these regs go into effect and they're within their 18 months, then those will benefit from having an additional 18 months. So it's almost...
Let's assume they're affected, right? So we're just going to extend the limitation on all these that are back there.
The projects that she has on her desk right now, if I'm right about the timing, and they now become effective, they'll basically automatically get an additional 18 months.
Assuming they can apply for it.
Assuming they've, paid their
Which they will.
deposits.
Okay, I'm not going to support that, Mr. Chairman. I don't know what the majority, it sounds like maybe the majority will, but I'm not going to.
Well, I like the idea of providing more time, but I keep looking at slide 3 from staff's proposal, and that was as of June of 2019, we had 9.6 megawatts of operating capacity. So had we not received an extension of this program, it would have probably been around that time that we would have started drafting our report for the General Assembly. So now we're still, I mean, that's the goal for this entire program, is to provide counsel and guidance to the General Assembly for the policies they would like to move forward with in the future. So now we're extending the process here for applications, and we're talking 36 months. I mean, that's 3 years. It almost seems like by now a number of our developers have had the opportunity, have 3 years of experience working with our community associations and county governments. The county governments have had experience in interacting with the developers. They know this program is here. I'm just concerned that we got a lesson already for the first 3 months, and by expanding the amount of time, we're getting ourselves right back into the same cycle. And so maybe in the 7th month or 7th year of this program, we've got a little more capacity because we have some that's already in the queue, but there'll still be a big chunk that's still sitting there that hasn't been approved in some way, and we just won't. Ms. Garofalo will have a lot more free time because she'll have less that she'll have to work on right away, but there'll still be a lot of them sitting out there. So I don't know. I guess I'd ask from the industry. You've been doing this for 3 years now. Do you still think that there needs to be an expansion of the time?
Well, I think we have somebody else who'd like to address this as well, but I would say this, Commissioner Linton, and that is that I think what this is recognizing is just the reality of the situation we're in, right? I think every developer would say that they are highly motivated to get their projects online as quickly as possible, right? They've invested money in these things. There's no group that comes before you asking for an extension because they kind of just, they like to take their time and kind of hang around. It's that you've given these waivers on good cause shown dozens of times now, and you sort of know the sort of, holdups that have hampered these projects. So I think this is just trying to recognize let's reduce the administrative burden of those requests, just recognizing that local jurisdictions are still getting up to speed on, how they want to handle these projects and things come up.
So
I think people want to move as quickly as they can. They're only here because they have to be, and they'll move, and they won't take 36 months if they don't have to.
So I guess to that point, for a developer that shows up in, pick one of our counties, Anne Arundel or Frederick, today and says, we like to move forward with a project like this. When they did that 3 years ago, Frederick County wasn't expecting them. And they've pretty much said as much. And Anne Arundel County the same way. They were having internal meetings. They were having creating ordinances in some cases. They were doing all these different things to try and prepare and figure out how to respond to these developers showing up in their county, using the land for solar developments. That's not the case now. Frederick County knows that developers out there, and if one shows up today and says, we'd like to move forward, they're funded, they're enthusiastic, they've got their plans in place, they are ready to move forward. Frederick County, at least from what we've heard after 3 years of this experience, they're more ready now than they were 3 years ago. So I guess the question is, we've extended the program, we're looking to get as much of this capacity used as possible. Are we really moving the industry and pushing the industry into that direction if we're giving them more time when the state as a whole is more prepared for their presence and their investment?
I guess my reaction to that would be, I think you could rely on the fact that they will endeavor to the industry will endeavor to get its projects in the ground as quickly as possible. And to the extent that there are counties and processes that are now much more well, informed and lubricated, you will see projects move more quickly. There's no benefit to a subscriber organization of their own sort of decision to delay this, There's one other point that I think deserves making, and that is that the need to come forward and ask for extensions, there's part of this is a certainty issue. If you have financial people that are ready to back your project and you're coming up to a deadline, that exists, now all of a sudden it's like the financing, starts to get tenuous as people say, hey, your project could get thrown out. We don't know what the commission is going to do in terms of offering extension. So bottom line is I think the industry is totally incentivized to move these as quickly as possible, and hopefully we will see exactly what you're saying, is that we will see projects move more quickly in many jurisdictions now. This just recognizes that to the extent that that doesn't happen in some jurisdictions and that some of these delays exist, is that something where that uncertainty should exist and your administrative burden should exist to continue to recognize all those cases that you've been having to entertain to offer extensions, or is this more in line with experience? It's simple.
Could you please state and spell your name? I'm going to move this along a little faster.
Sure.
Thank you.
My name is Will Fisher. It's WILLFISCHER. I'm here on behalf of Summit Ridge Energy. We're a solar project developer and financier. So we both participate in projects from the kind of landowner origination side, and we also participate in projects on the financing side. We're partnered with Hennon Armstrong to provide capital for the projects that we finance, headquartered in Annapolis, and appreciate your time today. I think we'd like to comment on and support the staff's proposal to push the project deadlines to 24 and 36 months. And Mr. Chairman, fellow commissioners, really do appreciate your time to speak through this today. We certainly have had personal pain going through this process. Of the year one projects in the community solar pilot program, we've had our hands in developing 7 of those and bringing them to receive permission to operate and eventually being commercially operational in 2019, supporting 2,000 households as ratepayers and subscribers. All 7 of these projects came in front of the commission to request not only one, but in some cases 2 extensions to their operational deadlines. And I fear that by picking and choosing kind of which projects to extend the deadlines for, you're just going to continue to be inundated by those requests. We have several pending with Gordon Feimler right now. I think the reality is that 24 and 36 months unfortunately reflects the situation on the ground as we're going through the local permitting process. As much as I would like to think that certain local planning boards and discretionary kind of authorities are becoming more I guess, used to and kind of expecting these projects to move forward. We haven't really seen that to be the case. We have a number of projects in Baltimore County, which as recent as last week, we just learned would be delayed another 9 to 12 months through an additional zoning change. This was after these projects, which were part of the Year 2 program, were already delayed through the special exceptions process, the appeals process, and are going to continue to be delayed. We've seen Harford County, we haven't seen any new growth of regulations specifically addressing how they would treat, or codes or ordinances addressing how they would accept or not permit these projects. In PG County, unfortunately, the timelines have not shrunk. We're still, still a year plus just to get through the MNC PBC process. And again, in Baltimore County, we've a number of projects now that we thought we were out of the woods, and it's not quite the case. So I would say that in general across the state, and I would encourage any of the other developers to support me on this, we don't see that there's been a kind of long learning curve or a gradual learning curve that would allow us to relax the 24 and 36 months. We realistically do see this as the best way to ensure success years 4 through 7 in the program, and to make sure that projects that did make it into the program in years 2 and 3 do reach commercial operation and provide the benefits that we hope that they provide to Maryland ratepayers. Last thing I will say is we do see that inadequate timelines for projects do freeze project development. Prior to reaching construction or moving forward in the project development process, we're investing tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars of development capital. The certainty around knowing if a project is going to be still in the program at the end of that development process is what allows us to continue to cut those checks. So that remains unchanged, whether it's year 2 of the program or year 5 or 7.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher, for sharing that real-life experience with us. Mr. Seegers, you've taken what was a consensus proposal.
That was not my intent.
And we've had quite a discussion on this to date. So I want to wrap this up, but you did ask your clarification question, which you only heard from me and perhaps Commissioner O'Donnell on, with respect to retroactivity of this regulation once it takes effect. I would associate myself with Commissioner Herman's position that if we have a project with an operation date, that is their operation date. However, I believe that to the extent that they run into delays and we have a new regulation, the rules have changed and they can avail themselves of the new regulation. That's my position. Commissioner Richard.
I would agree. I think this is an important change and improvement we're making. It's based on what we've learned about the program over the last 3 years. I think, I don't think we help the process at all, requiring these people to come in, the developer to come in to get these waivers prematurely, and so I enthusiastically support this change. And I agree. Certainly, these developers want to operate. They're not looking to spend time here trying to get waivers. So,
Just to be clear, we're not ruling right now on the proposed regulation, which is consensus, but just on the question of retroactivity.
Yeah, but I think I would
you
agree
wanted
with
to
you.
say that.
Okay. I mean, I'll do both at the same
Both,
time.
okay.
Yeah, retroactivity, because let's just fix the problem.
Commissioner O'Donnell, same position?
No, I want to say a few things. Since June of 2019, 154 megawatts have been offered in the 4 service territories in the state of Maryland. 106.8 have been accepted. But what's operating today is 9.6 megawatts, less than 10% of what's been accepted into the program. That's an abysmal record, in my opinion. And I think we need to keep the heat on getting these programs out there. If we really believe in solar, and we do, and I believe that the developers do and the advocates do, we need to keep the heat on these. But if there are problems with financing, which I believe is right at the nub of most of these projects, if it's really about financing, if we take the heat off because you can't get your subscribers, you can't get your financiers to line up behind you right, maybe because you're approaching a deadline or maybe for some other reasons, it's too easy to get a waiver. So I am supportive of the increase in the time limits because we've seen that that's failed. But this notion, now you're going to apply these retroactively to people who may have already applied, got their $50 per kW waiver. They paid the money. Now, are they gonna be back in here saying, I paid the money, but I can avail myself of this new time limit, I want my money back, I didn't have to pay it yet. I think it's a bad notion, I think these should be prospective only, and I know I'm in the minority on this, but it's a matter of principle with me. I am not supporting this if it's retroactive in any manner.
Thank you. Commissioner Linton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've played the 10th man on this long enough. I think I will not support the idea of modifying the application deadlines if it includes allowing a company to continue to extend beyond the 36 months by moving beyond what their operational deadline already is, what's already been presented. So I'm comfortable with the 24 to 36 months as long as it's for projects that are new to us and not projects that are already in the queue.
Thank you. Commissioner Herman. Do you have anything to add beyond what you said earlier?
No.
Okay. Thank you. So the commission unanimously agrees to the consensus regulation 4C, the operational deadline. Commissioner O'Donnell, do you wish to change your vote?
I'm not changing my vote, I think I heard you kind of rule that this had retroactive application, and I think I heard Commissioner Richards say the same thing. And I'm not supporting that.
Okay, we're only taking a vote on the proposed regulation.
Yeah, but that may be a difference without distinction if attached to that is retroactivity. I want it very clear. I'm voting no if it does have a component of retroactivity to it.
Mr. Seegers was asking for the advice of the commission on whether or not these regulations would have a retroactive effect.
I'll just vote no. That'll be clear for me.
Okay. The consensus regulations are approved. Next item, Mr. Vanderheyden.
Your Honor, this is the last slide with regulation changes on it. Staff is making this, proposing this change in order to clarify the kind of underlying principle that there should be a single project on a single parcel. Sorry, keep doing that. I'm sorry. Slide 19. The language here is essentially trying to avoid a problem that we've had in one instance already, and to prevent anything further where there might be an issue where it was inferred from a single regulation without looking at all of them that you were permitted to have more than one project on a single parcel. So this is attempting to clarify that and eliminate that situation from being brought to the commission again.
This is consensus?
I think there are some concerns about it, and again, I'll probably need to let the solar folks address that. There is, let me just finish up. The language that is shown here up here in the red at the top is the existing language. I just highlighted the red stuff to. It becomes very difficult to kind of, for me anyway, to pick apart when we're the definitions that excluding 500 kW is in place there. But effectively, an electric company cannot accept a CGS project if it's proposed to be on the same or adjacent property as an existing project that's owned by the same subscriber organization. So folks have looked at that and said, oh, well, I can have another project on this piece of property if it's not owned by the same subscriber organization or an affiliate. Now, staff, reads this, and I think the intent is pretty clear. In item 4, it says you can't build more than one of these on a single piece of property. You may not one or more subscriber organizations may not construct multiple facilities on a single parcel of property. We're trying to clarify this piece of the regulation to make it clear that you may not essentially build more than one. The concern there is that it's possible perhaps to by using parcels that you could concentrate more than the 2 megawatt cap and effectively create a kind of a loophole that would allow you to build more than a 2 megawatt facility. That is kind of the primary concern for this. The existing regulation would permit a project to be built right next door on a parcel that's adjacent, and we changed the word property to parcel in order to clarify the tax parcels, which is now the means by which the utilities, from our understanding, are identifying a specific piece of property rather than using an address, because we found that in some cases there's more than one address to be applied to a property. So tax parcel is what they're using. Essentially the key word here is the word any, which is right next to the word same, which is being removed in the highlighted section in section A1. So in this case, you would not be able to construct a facility on the same piece of property or an adjacent property if it was located next to any project by any subscriber organization. And that is, we believe that is to clarify the existing policy and to avoid any future misunderstandings about how that is to be read.
Thank you. Parties wish to respond to the proposal of staff.
Yes, Commissioner. Again, Salar Naini with Turning Point Energy representing CCSA on this matter. I think the challenge with the language as proposed by staff, us as developers, we have been operating under an assumption, that assumption being that should, let's say, a competitor of ours have a parcel on one side of the street and a project that they've been developing for a potential program, as long as we are separate subscriber organizations, including affiliates, and we think the language is pretty clear on that, then there should be no issue with us developing a project. And so we believe that the modification to the proposal would kind of alleviate that, and that's been an assumption, like I said, that we've been operating under. I'd go further. Want to be abundantly clear that CCSA is very supportive of regulations against gaming of co-location and ensuring that projects truly remain community projects. And so in the language that you'll see before you, we have proposed an alternative that goes a step further past what are currently in the regulations, but kind of a compromise in our view, which essentially says that if the projects are we'll separate them into two buckets, kind of call it years 1 through 3 projects or 4 through 7. If they are separate in those two buckets and they are indeed separate subscriber organizations, then co-location in that situation should be allowed. In other words, if my firm, Turning Point Energy, decides to develop a project that happens to be across the street from an operation project from years 1 through 3, and we're applying for years 4 through 7, we've been operating under a current assumption. We shouldn't be penalized for operating under one assumption that's been in the regulations.
So let me parse this out.
Sure.
How is it that something across the street is adjacent?
The legal definition of adjacent, if there's like a roadway separating properties, that is considered adjacent.
That's adjacent. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. Not a real estate lawyer. The other question I have is, if it's already accepted, in year 3, why it wouldn't apply anyway? So why do you need the exception?
So I guess for the project that would be applying for year 4. So in other words,
applying for year 4, then the exemption wouldn't apply because it says for program years 4 through 7 in your own draft.
Right. So I guess what we're trying to say is if it's in those two buckets of years. So in other words, if it's in the program for years 1 through 3, then that year 4 through 7 project that may be across the street should be able to go forward. And we don't feel the current, as staff has drafted it, essentially eliminates that ability to do that. I'm sorry, was that, I
Well,
know
I'm
this
just
is,
trying to understand, because if something is already, if the utility accepted one project,
correct.
right? And then you're saying that if something's across the street in year 7 or in year 5, just because the project on one side of the street was accepted in year 2, that should be okay? Is that what I'm hearing?
We're saying that, yes, we're saying that as long as it's separated between those two big broad buckets, then yeah, that should be allowed. And again, that's kind of a compromise position that we're coming forth with today, to go a step further than what it's currently at, but at the same time recognizing that maybe there's that if we separate them out between years 1 through 3 and 4 through 7, that's a long enough period of time to where it should alleviate some of those concerns.
Mr. Vanderhayden, it seems to me, like your view on this, but it seems to me that this is basically an exemption if you already have an existing project and you want to build something across the street. Do I have that right?
I mean, from what is being expressed by Solar, yes, it seems that there's a desire to be able to construct another property, another project across the street, or, I mean, perhaps even right next door.
Or right next
I think that's precisely what we're trying to avoid anyone attempting to do.
Right. That's what I thought. Okay, thank you.
Right, and those are from, and apologies, I just wanted to jump in, those are from separate so, the distinction is right now, you can be separate organizations, right? So if it's, if it's the same, we understand where co-location could be a concern if one developer is building one project next to another one and one across the street, let's say, but if they're completely different entities, there's we think, developers are moving forward in good faith not to, they're not getting any advantage from that, so to speak.
Okay. Mr. Vanderhayden, I have a couple questions on your draft, and maybe it directs to Ms. Garofalo. Located in its service territory, are you trying to pick up the fact that you could have one in one service territory and button up against another service territory? I mean, I'm trying
Yes.
to
Yes, this is an old,
understand
I
why
would
you
say
have
this is an
service
old
territories
problem.
there.
I think it comes from each utility saying, hey, we're not trying to keep track of what the other utilities are doing. We're not going to check against their list of projects. So it would be ideal if we could perhaps also impose that, but I think originally the utility said, look, we don't really want to have we know how big this is going to get. We don't want to have to try to track what's being constructed on the other side of the service territory line.
My goodness. Okay. The second part, any subscriber organization or affiliate thereof. Did the affiliate thereof apply to the any subscriber organization? What does the affiliate thereof
Yes.
apply to?
We're essentially trying to struggle with we know that in many cases the subscriber organization, they're formed for specific projects. Sometimes things are transferred. I think we are now accepting that the word affiliate applies to an ownership affiliation, although I think originally, and we haven't yet made any changes in this regard, there are definitely relationships between the subscriber organizations that don't reflect direct ownership, but reflect like shared services where one does the subscription billing for the other while also maintaining projects of their own. Some of the subscriber organizations seem to have solely a development function, and that they, which they need for the purpose of getting they need a subscriber organization to build the project, but then they're conveying it. So whether or not this is the most artful way to incorporate the idea that if there's an affiliate that is constructing but is perhaps not also a subscriber organization, I think we're trying to capture that, as well as simply if you have joint ownership, through a corporate structure, or if you have, potentially an arrangement with another subscriber organization, that would not be something that could be used to kind of create a loophole.
So do you have to be a subscriber organization to apply for a CSEG project?
Yes.
Okay. So if you do, I'm not sure why an affiliate thereof would be, because it's any subscriber organization, so any means any. So do we need the or affiliate thereof, Ms. Garofalo? I generally tend not to like extra words in a regulation if I don't need them. But I'm just trying to understand. But I do want to make sure that we don't create a loophole. I'm not. I agree that I want to close all the loopholes, but I was sort of confused by what kind of affiliate wouldn't be included by any subscriber organization.
You're talking about just getting rid of the word thereof, correct?
Or affiliate. Isn't it any subscriber organization?
Well, so the subscriber.
Maybe I'm wrong. I'm just trying to make sure.
So what we see is there may be like a parent organization. It may or may not be a CSEG. And then it may own several subscriber organizations. These are often incorporated or formed as LLCs.
But then again, aren't they
separately.
all any? Because the only entity that can apply for a CSEG project is a subscriber organization. So.
That's correct. That's true.
Oh, yes, I see. So by adding any, we may have fixed the problem. I see.
Right.
I see your point.
That's what I'm getting.
Yeah. So, but nonetheless, they still are off. It's not unusual for multiple subscriber organizations separately incorporated or formed as LLCs, separately named, to have a parent who may or may not be a CSEG. So often you might get multiple applications. And
well, I tell you what, I'll vote for it because I believe strongly I do not accept the exemption that the SA. Sorry, it's getting late. I'm starting to lose my acronyms. My personal view is that I would not accept the CCSA proposal. I would go with the staff, and I would accept it as written, and just, because generally speaking, we don't want extra words we don't need. Think about that for the next round, Ms. Garofalo, and determine whether or not those words are helpful or necessary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Herman. If the other commissioners are in a position to vote, we'll go in reverse order, with Commissioner Herman going first. Commissioner Linton.
Well, I would have supported removing the words, but if we are going to leave them there, that's fine. I do think, though, that there's a typo after the word "and is owned by." There's a "the" still there, which I don't think you need anymore now that you have "any." So with that minor typo, I'm fine with the revision.
Sorry, Commissioner Linton, what was that?
You need just take the word "the" out.
Oh.
So is it "and is owned by the"?
Right.
You don't need any more.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
Yes, I'm supportive of staff's. I'm sorry. I am supportive of staff's proposal as written.
Commissioner Richard.
I would support CCSA. I think when we have these parcels of land that people, as we've heard, it's difficult to get support in some cases for these projects, and once you have a good site that people accept, I think if these projects are in the queue and have been legitimately constituted, then I think we want to use these particular sites well, and so I would agree and would want to urge that we would support the success of these projects.
I would also support the staff proposal noting the typo. Mr. Vander Hayden, what do we have next? It looks like we're out of slides pretty soon.
I just have just a few notes, just for the commission's information. Once the matters are dealt with regarding the regulations, we will need to come in to the commission with modifications for the utility tariffs, and then we will need to develop a selection process, which may be the same one we've used, but we'll need to formalize that for years 4 through 7. One of the things I would note, it's been suggested by a number of the parties in their comments that there are a lot of other areas they would like to address with changes to the regulations. Staff is not recommending that they be taken up now because we have some desire to comply with SB 520 and get that done. But we think that there's certainly an opportunity kind of midway through our program to do some more comprehensive tweaks. And so if the commission, is otherwise not objecting to it, we would suggest that it's likely we would propose to the working group a follow-on rulemaking that probably would not take place until after the first half of 2020 to address any number of these problems and possibly, reach out and cover some of these areas that have been suggested here, but that we are not recommending.
Thank you. I'd like to recognize you.
Yes, this is John Forgash again, and this is not a comment that was included in staff's proposal comments, but just to circle back around on the co-location issue within PEPCO that was proposed, we'd like just to offer some additional comments in terms of, once again, in the PEPCO territory, no LMI projects have been submitted for, essentially submitted for capacity. That represents about 15 megawatts of projects currently going unused in PEPCO service territory. The co-location language as proposed right now would immediately provide an opportunity to help incentivize those projects by a simple modification from a siting perspective. Hold on a second here. Trying to turn my computer on.
You're referencing the CCSA proposal.
We're referencing the Soul Harvest proposal.
Soul Harvest
LMI advocates, yes. And Synergen proposal as well. But what the previous slide didn't show was the exemptions that are located in Section B of the co-location, and currently exempted from those projects are rooftop projects, projects in the industrial zone, 6 megawatts for brownfield locations, over parking lots or roadways, and multiple level parking structures. These are all premium projects that do need some sort of incentive to move forward and for lenders to get comfortable with. We do see that there is an issue in PEPCO with filling that category bucket, and are worried that, as we put together that report that's detailing the specifics in terms of how is LMI going to be incorporated within the data that's received, that there could be a possibility that no LMI projects will be developed in PEPCO before, additional comments are going to be received in the middle of 2020. So I think we're just asking the staff right now to, to think about an opportunity to incentivize LMI projects by adding a sentence into that section so that they would also be able to co-locate in PEPCO and therefore bring LMI projects potentially to the front of the line, and also therefore providing some opportunity for LMI subscribers to do the same.
Thank you. Obviously, we do have a problem with LMI in particular service territories. The Commission is not taking up your proposal today. You've heard some concerns or criticisms, whether it be the CPCN or getting input of the counties, as well as the fact that it is a utility-specific proposal, which causes this commissioner some concern. However, that's without prejudice to raising this issue during the next round of rulemakings that will be occurring next year, as Mr. Van der Hayden just mentioned. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Forgash. Any additional items? Mr. Warren.
Yes, Commissioner. So we are prepared here. The CCSA comments included, in addition to addressing the recommendations made by staff, a number of additional recommendations for rule changes. There are 7 in particular that we haven't covered here yet in today's hearing. We would strongly urge the Commission to take up these proposed changes as part of this rulemaking process, and not to defer them to some future unspecified additional rulemaking event. We say that for a few reasons. First of all, obviously the industry has invested a lot of effort and a lot of time in looking at regulations and coming forward with recommendations that we think will make the program work better, that maybe are really necessary for making the program work better. And so we're hoping, based on your initial commentary at the outset of the proceeding, that you're willing to entertain those. I would hope that you could in this proceeding. We appreciate that. From a timing perspective, I also know that based on the timing that we saw in the original rulemaking in this proceeding, we had our first hearing in December. I believe it's my understanding that we're in a bit of a suspension period here where the AELR committee is really not in a position to review proposed regulations for a couple of months anyway. So we think that there's time to continue to take up these regulations. Maybe a final point is that the recommendations that CCSA is making, these are recommendations that were brought up as early as August in substantially the same form. They were put forward by Summit Ridge Energy with my assistance with them, bringing these forward back in August. And so here we are 4 months later, and there's really been no kind of discussion and vetting of these things, in the working group process. And kind of here we are to sort of bring these forward, looking for a path forward to get these changes made. So I am prepared today or at any other time to work through the other 7 recommendations that we have with the Commission. And again, we would strongly urge and request that the Commission make these a part of this rulemaking and give us one complete process to clean up everything that we know that needs to be addressed in these rules, not just the particular set of recommendations that staff chose to bring forward.
Thank you, Mr. Warren. I recognize that CCSA has spent a lot of time and effort with these additional regulations that are before the Commission right now. The November 27th notice issued by the Executive Secretary made very clear that the comments were to be made on the proposed regulations issued by staff. These additional proposals, not ruling on the merits, are outside of that scope, implementing SB 520. Obviously, the hour is drawing near. It's almost 5 o'clock. You do have 7 additional proposals that we haven't even touched today. And I understand your concern that you don't want to wait until the next rulemaking, but I don't see that it's squarely before the Commission and its notice for the purpose of today's rulemaking.
I appreciate your commentary. The only one comment that I would make, maybe in response to that, is that certainly staff elected to go beyond what was exactly required to implement the statute by selecting a couple of changes that they wanted to make, and some of them are ones that CCSA obviously supports. So I do understand you're trying to put a boundary around that, but I do think that the other recommendations that the CCSA members would like to make, stand equal footing with some of the changes that staff, saw fit to introduce into their proposed rules. So I would hope that you take up the full menu of things that have been requested for you to look at.
Right. Unfortunately, we will not be able to do that today. We're going to be running out of time momentarily. There's 7. Obviously, I think we're going to need more than about 10 minutes to discuss your remaining seven items.
Return.
Can I just ask Mr. Chairman, when would we be taking these other 7 up? Because I guess I thought we were going to be
Mr. Vanderheyden,
having a little bit broader of a look at some of the recommendations of the industry. As it was pointed out, we did go slightly beyond what was in the legislation, which I'm glad we did. But how did we decide not to take up any of these other 7?
Well,
this is news to me.
No, the November 27th notice was clear that comments were to be made on the proposals by staff.
Okay.
These go beyond that. Mr. Vanderheyden, when do you expect that we could take up additional proposed regulations?
Your Honor, I think we could. You were talking about accelerating an additional rulemaking. These regulations were filed last Friday on the 13th. Folks obviously haven't had time to adjust or to read them and to understand them.
So this is the first time you're seeing CCSA's?
I think the concepts that have been raised in here, that we've been talking about these possibly as tariff adjustments or certain things that we simply would be asking the utilities to do. I'm not sure, having not thoroughly vetted all of them, if all of these are appropriate to lock into stone into regulation. Some of these are matters that may need to be different for each utility and are probably more appropriate for tariffs. And it's possible that some of them may be simply the utilities maybe make an operational change that we don't need to even go through a tariff process. We have not had the opportunity to review these regulations. I don't think any of the party staff has not since they were filed. We would need to have to establish a second rulemaking session where notice would be provided that commission's going to consider these in order to properly do that. That much being said, there are a number of things I don't think we would want to try to undertake another rulemaking process separate just to cover these during the legislative session, because there are, I'm sure, other issues that folks would like to bring if we are undertaking a more comprehensive look at the program. So, to the extent that these are issues that are going to affect the operations of existing projects, I think we would want to work with the utilities to say, hey, can you provide this information better? Do we need to actually put this in your tariff? Compel these. I think these are designed to compel certain performances from the utility folks, and I don't know that we could tell you right now if that's the best thing to put in regulations. So we can have if it's commission's desire to accelerate and have an additional rulemaking, we can do that once we figure out our resources and how long it will take to gather up any of the other issues.
Yes, I would like to be equitable. I recognize time and effort has been spent. I'm not passing judgment, Mr. Warren, on this proposal. But the staff and the work group only received these on December last week. I think more time needs to be spent on reviewing it.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if I don't mean to be combative, but if I could, I would like to again emphasize something I said a moment ago. The CCSA recommendations that have not yet been covered, in substantially the form that you're seeing them, were submitted to the working group in writing by Summit Ridge Energy on August the 28th. This followed a working group meeting on August the 20th where they were mentioned and then they were formalized in writing. The next working group meeting was not scheduled till October the 23rd. At that time, staff convened the working group, and over the next 4 sessions, the working group only focused narrowly on some of the proposals that you've seen staff bring forward today. That was the scope that staff was prepared to discuss in those working group meetings, and you've even heard today that some of their proposals, the one particularly on the 5%, LMI, hadn't really been vetted that much. Here's what I would ask you to consider, Chairman Stanek. I think the industry feels like we keep being timed out on making progress on the changes that we see by the process. We brought things forward in a very timely way in August for consideration, and by virtue of the scheduling of the working group meetings and the 2-hour sessions and the content of those meetings, if there are people who feel they haven't had the chance to discuss these, well, it has to do with the conduct, what's been transpiring in the working group meetings, and to sort of be here in this hearing today. And I totally respect the Commission's very pressing time and calendar, but to sort of be in a situation once again where it's like, well, you brought these things forward in August, they didn't get vetted in the, till now, and it's 5 o'clock, and, we have to move on with this rulemaking, and we'll push this down the road further. Again, I just urge you to consider that these issues have been brought forward in a very timely way in the past. They do deserve to be heard, and pushing them down the road because we keep getting timed out in the discussion is something that I don't think it's serving the interest of the subscribers and the other parties, the other stakeholders, in the process. So again, I would urge you to continue this if you can.
We will not be continuing this rulemaking today, but I recognize your concern and your frustration. Any of the parties, including CCSA, is free to petition for a rulemaking whenever you'd like, instead of leaving it up to staff council to determine when we have this next rulemaking session, and the commission will entertain that at that time.
I just want to add that I'm frustrated as well. I thought we were going to try to take on more of these issues today, and I didn't realize we were going to be limited. And I I recall talking to staff over the last several months, asking specifically, are we going to be able to look at and entertain some of the concerns of the industry? I mean, this was our big opportunity today at this rulemaking, and again, this is the first I'm hearing that we were only going to look at just what staff was submitting. I mean, otherwise, why did we even ask for other comments?
Your other,
And what's are we meeting again in January? Or what's happening with the low and moderate income?
I believe we're meeting on January the 8th, is that right?
Yes, Your Honor. Staff
We do have another rulemaking.
Staff has made a petition for an interpretation of two elements. One was the rollover from year 2 to 3. The other was the appropriate means of verifying LMI participants. So we filed a petition asking for clarification.
I'm sorry, if I could just clarify what's on your current docket. There were 2 separate requests made by staff. One on waiving the requirement to reallocate capacity. You've put that on your administrative calendar for January the 8th. The other was the petition to hear things about the LMI certification rules. You have asked for comments to be provided to you on January the 6th. You have not yet scheduled any hearing on that at an administrative meeting or otherwise that I'm aware of. So just to clarify where you are procedurally as to what you have before you.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, do you have anything to add? Is that correct? That's correct. Okay. All right, so we need one more date.
Excuse me, Mr. Chair. The waiver's sitting on the administrative meeting, the draft agenda for the 8th right now. And we're waiting for comments back on the other filing by the staff.
And the comment period is still open?
It is.
It is January the 6th.
Thank you, thank you.
So the notice, Mr. Chairman, for today's rulemaking says that comments on the proposed regulation shall be filed by Friday, December 13th, 2019. And it didn't elicit, our notice didn't elicit comments on things outside those proposed regulations. And so for that reason, I'm not supportive of staying here longer to entertain these items. I don't have prejudice towards these items. I think they can be considered later in due process. And in fact, I'm not even supportive of a special rulemaking. I think they should be taken up in the next kind of rulemaking we have on this particular regulation. So that's my opinion. Or in the alternative, we could stay here and take them up. But I don't recommend we do that.
Do other commissioners wish to make any final statements? No. Thank you. Mr. Warren, as I noted, CCSA is free to petition the commission to have a continuance for this rulemaking, or Mr. Vanderheyden will have a rulemaking scheduled sometime in the coming year. When did you say?
I was anticipating the second half.
Second half of 2020.
Not before July.
Okay. Thank you. Seeing no additional business before this commission, this hearing is adjourned.
Sections that don't mean anything to you.
Hey, folks.
We're fine. You don't have the update.
No, we're not filing comments.
Commission is back on the record in this matter. We forgot to take a final motion with respect to the rulemaking. I therefore move to publish the following revised proposed regulations as filed by staff in this docket on November 26, 2019, and as amended here today in the Maryland Register for notice and comment subject to non-substantive changes necessary to conform to COMAR drafting requirements. That includes revisions to COMAR Title 20, Subtitle 62, Chapter 2, Regulations 1 through 4, and to revise COMAR Title 20, Subtitle 62, Chapter 3, Regulations 4 through 8. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? 4 and 8. I'm sorry, I think I said 4 through 8. I don't believe we adopted that. No, yeah. So just to be clear, the second part was to revise COMAR Title 20, Subtitle 62, Chapter 3, Regulations 4 and 8. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion carries. Thank you.